To today's Scottish Police Authority meeting in Merchants House in Glasgow. I have apologies from Mary Pitt-Casey, a board member. Do I have any other apologies? Thank you. It's a requirement of our code of conduct that members declare any financial or other interests and connections in relation to today's business. Can I ask members to confirm if there are any declarations of interest or connections? Okay, thank you. Can I also confirm that there are no items other than those on the agenda that members wish to raise? Thank you. Now, in accordance with section 20 of our standing orders, can I confirm that members are content to take the following items in private? Item 9, which is to approve the minute of items taken in private at the board meetings of the 24th of August to discuss pay and reward. And item 15 to discuss the annual accounts and report and accounts. And these are discussed in private until they are laid in Parliament. They're not for us to release to the public until they are released to the public by the Parliament. Are you content to take these two items in private? Thank you. Can I ask you to approve or make any comment on the minutes of our board meeting on the 24th of August? Are there any changes to suggest? Excellent. So we're going to approve those minutes. We have a rolling action log. One action is proposed for ongoing and one action proposed for closure. Unless there are any comments, I invite the members to approve the action log. Thank you. In terms of decisions which we always report, which have been made since the last full authority meeting on the 24th of August, since that meeting, there has been one decision taken by correspondence, and that was to make an approval relating to the staff pay offer. And I'll say a little bit more about that in my chair's notes. So with that, can I come on to my chair's report? And I will take my report as read, as always. I just want to mention one important matter, that this morning the Chief Executive has been formally informed that the trade union, both trade unions within Police Scotland, have accepted that pay offer that we agreed to make to them. I'm absolutely delighted with that. And congratulations to all within the trade union and the negotiating teams for bringing that resolution here today. I'm really delighted. So thank you very much. Any comment you'd like to make about that, Chief Executive?
Just to emphasise, to thank the staff that worked on the pay award to the successful conclusion.
Thanks very much. And that the pay award was an item in my chair's report. That's why it's now been concluded. I have nothing else to raise with members. Any members got any issues to raise with me? If not, I'll come on to the committee reports. The chairs of the committees. Now I'm going to take them in a slightly different order than they are in the agenda paper, because I want to talk. I want the Resources Committee to start off with this. So, as always, before I invite the chairs of the committees, I do this, and this is an innovation over the last 2 years, to ask the committee chairs not only to publish their committee reports, but also give a verbal report against an outline report at each board meeting, because of the depth and extent of their scrutiny in committee, and to remind everybody that all those committees are live streamed. The live streams are available to watch if you couldn't actually watch on the day, and the minutes are published at a suitable time. So we have a number of committee reports. I'm going to start off with Grant McRae to report on Resources Committee. Grant.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to focus on one aspect of my report, the financial monitoring of actual revenue expenditure for the 4 months to July, and the worsening revised forecast for the full year. I think it would be helpful to begin by looking at the timeline over the last 6 months. When the board approved the balanced budget for 2023-24 on the 23rd of March this year, following a lot of detailed study, it was on the clear understanding that the 3 tests of a balanced budget, prioritising threats and vulnerabilities in Scotland, and maintaining a positive response to 999 calls would all be met. Chief Constable Livingston confirmed to the board that despite financial challenges, he was confident Scotland can be effectively and efficiently policed in the year ahead based on the proposed budget for 23-24. We very much trusted that confirmation, so based on these assurances, the authority approved the budget for 2023-24. By the end of April, expenditure on overtime was higher than budget, and the Police Scotland Finance team started to highlight its concern. At the meeting of the Resources Committee on the 14th of June, the Police Scotland Finance team reported actual overspends on police officer core overtime. The Chief Finance Officer confirmed that although overspend on overtime for the year was forecast, steps were being taken to address this, which would see a reduction in the coming months. Members asked if local commanders were aware of the need to closely manage overtime budgets. We were assured by the CFO this message had been cascaded, and he was seeing evidence of changed behaviours which would go some way to getting the budget back on track in the coming months. At the next Resources Committee meeting on the 8th of August, the Q1 actual net expenditure year to date was reported as an overspend versus budget of some £3.5 million, with a full year forecast of £24.3 million over budget, mainly due to overspends relating to pay, police staff costs, police officer overtime, and police officer pensions. This was offset by an estimated £5.4 million funding receivable from the Scottish Government as part of the autumn and spring budget reviews. So the net overspend against funding was £18.9 million. It was reported to the committee that it was critical that Police Scotland needed to take action to start delivering the 3.7% savings included in the budget, as well as taking further action to bring other overspends back in line or to identify corresponding savings to ensure delivery of a balanced budget. The committee was advised that internal discussions were still ongoing to agree the specific measures to be implemented to reduce the emerging overspend of £18.9 million. At a meeting of the Resources Committee on 22nd September, last Friday, it was reported that mitigating actions of £18.9 million had been agreed by the Force Executive. However, the management accounts to the end of July showed the projected overspend had increased to £19.2 million. So further steps were under consideration to achieve a balanced budget in the remaining months. Clearly, had the right steps been taken to manage the budget from month one, the impact on service delivery would have been much less than those required now, with only 6 months left in the financial year. The Resources Committee understands the scale of the revenue budget challenge, which proposes significant additional mitigating steps to be adopted and delivered at pace. We asked the two Deputy Chief Constables to provide assurance that given the operational impact of these proposed mitigations, they could be delivered within the 6 months to the end of the current financial year, and the people of Scotland would still be kept safe. The DCCs explained that they were still studying the operational impact of the 19.2 million savings proposed over the previous few days, so could not yet provide the Resources Committee with that assurance. I therefore have to report to the board today that none of the members of the Resources Committee have sufficient confidence in the delivery of this evolving plan to bring the budget back to a break-even position by 31st March 2024. It is, of course, important to bear in mind that while 19.2 million is a large figure, it's only 1.5% of the expenditure forecast for the year of 1.3 billion of expenditure. So with strong management and tracking of this plan, this should certainly be achievable. We have therefore asked for monthly meetings with the DCCs, the Deputy Chief Officer and the Finance team to monitor closely the delivery of the ongoing mitigations in order that we can report back to the board on progress of this plan. Chair, I'm happy to take the remainder of my report as read, but happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much for that. Any board members want to make any comment? On that?
Thanks, Chair. I do have a number of questions, but I wonder whether it might be possible to hear from Police Scotland and then ask those questions. I don't know if that might be the right way round.
Of course, yep.
Thanks, Chair. And it may well be that once we hear from our Police Scotland colleagues, the answer will be given. But I wondered, Grant, if the Resources Committee had a sense of when a balanced budget would be presented and being brought back into line. Do you have a timescale for it?
Thanks, Fiona. I think basically we were presented with this larger than planned deficit only on Friday, and it was quite clear that Police Scotland finance team have been working very hard on this revised estimate over the previous few days. I think the key thing to me is to be sure that all the many steps, mitigating steps that were on that list, some of which are relatively straightforward, others are much more complicated and require other things to be considered. I'm hoping by the time we have our next meeting with the special meeting, if you like, that I've asked for monthly, to come through by the time we have our next one, which will be in October, I'm hoping that they will have bottomed out the operational impact on this and work out whether these steps are actually deliverable or not, or whether other things have got to come through. So I'm hoping by the end of October, we should be a bit more clear as to whether we are going to be on something that's deliverable or whether further steps have got to be thought through.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And apologies if I'm jumping slightly ahead, but what I would like to do here is connect the report from Resources Committee to the report that I will give and provide later for Performance Committee. There is a connection between resource, the outputs that produces, and then the desired outcomes that we intend, which is an improvement in policing. One of the concerns that was raised during the Performance Committee is that in a number of areas, detection rates were falling, response times were falling, and one of the replies that we got from Police Scotland, one of the causes that they were describing is a reduction in resources within the organisation, leading to a drop in performance. So one of the key things that we would like to see drawn out is we recognise that Police Scotland have been very clear that they will prioritise high threat, risk and harm areas, but actually what are these high risk, threat and harm areas? What areas of policing do they mean by this? So there's a transparency in areas that we would see being protected and performance being maintained and hopefully improved, in areas that perhaps we may see a reduction in performance because they have not been prioritised as part of that high threat, risk and harm within the organisation. I know that there is a complexity in this, and it's not just as simple as how much resources put in leading to the desired outcome, but there is a connection there, and I would just like to get a better understanding, based on the comments that have just been made by my colleague from Resources Committee about how transparent can we be in terms of what Police Scotland will prioritise and how that will feed through to performance in the organisation.
Thank you very much. Would you just move on to your own report, or is that sufficient from your own committee?
Of course. Policing Performance Committee took place on the 12th of September 2023. There was a number of areas that are covered in there. We looked at operational policing policy. Two of the highlights from that is the changes that have been made in relation to cyber kiosks, but also a really important programme, which has been the rollout of the lock zone, and we really welcomed at that meeting the support that has now been broadly given right across Police Scotland, which helps towards improving Scotland's poor record on drugs deaths. The substantive part of the The whole meeting was around performance reporting and improvement activity, and I think in the question that I posed there, I highlighted the concern that we had a number of areas. There appears to be a decline in performance, and that has been connected by Police Scotland colleagues to the resourcing question. So my question is the clarity on what will be prioritised. That was the key question from the committee. We also looked at public confidence areas. There's been a number of pieces of work commissioned on that, and there's ongoing monitoring of this, and it's a key area because, as we know, in Scotland, as across the rest of the United Kingdom, policing is done by consent, and you absolutely need the trust and the support of the public to do that. So monitoring that. So those were the key areas that we looked like. Take the rest of the paper as read, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Alistair, any questions for the Chair of Policing Performance Committee? Thank you very much. Just to draw everybody's attention to the executive summary of the performance report included in the papers. Are always very important to read that. Just illustrates the scale and scope of policing across Scotland, which is always important to bring back just what an extraordinary scale of policing is. So we will come back, I'm sure, to these issues later. The next is Complaints and Conduct Committee. Can I ask Chair Katharina Casper to speak to your committee?
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you. The committee met on the 22nd of August, and we discussed a number of important topics, so I take the report as read. It's all set out in the report. There's probably two themes which I would quite like to draw out. So the first one is around complaints handling performance. As the quality and presentation of data on complaints handling continues to improve to the committee, members were really keen to shift the conversation from volume of complaints, which actually tend to be relatively static over time, and into actually data which enables the committee to see the accuracy of complaint handling and the timeliness of complaint handling. And what was also being drawn out as being very important is the contextual elements around that complaints data. So again, members were very keen to see additional data presented that enables us to put the volume of complaints into a context. And demographic data, again, is something which keeps coming up as a priority for the committee to get a much better understanding of. So the ambition is very much to shift away purely from volume, looking at volumes, into actually getting a little bit more in depth into the quality and timeliness of complaint handling procedures in Police Scotland. So that's really quite important. And the second theme, I suppose, which was also quite consistent across a number of topics that were discussed in the committee, is the importance of a coordinated assurance picture. There's a number of different bodies that look at how Police Scotland handles complaints and conduct matters. It's obviously the SPA, it's HMICS, it's PERC on a regular basis. So for us as a committee, it is incredibly important to make sure that there is this consistency across different sources of assurance, that there's no double handling to some degree, and that what we get are some really, really valuable bits of insight across all of these strands of assurance. So that, again, that's something that the committee is taking forward with various partners. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions to the chair of that committee? If not, it falls to me. The next one, I chair the Exceptional Circumstances Committee. By its very name, it meets exceptionally. I chaired two meetings of this committee on the 28th of June and the 28th of August in relation to a senior officer matter. These met in private session for the reasons set out in my update to you and consistent with our corporate governance framework. And I think I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you. The next chair is Fiona McQueen, who chairs our People Committee. Fiona.
Thanks, Chair. We met in August, and there are a number of continuing themes there. I think similar to complaints and conduct, looking for the evidence of assurance of improvement, particularly around well-being of the workforce. But we're seeing good progress made with the concept of how the data is presented and how we can measure effectiveness and improvement. we looked at the mental health work that had been done and the outcomes that were being taken forward there. And we've yet to receive that assurance that we'll have a comprehensive whole system approach to ensuring mental health and well-being and catching the whole workforce. But I'm content that the progress that's being made is appropriate, and we look forward to seeing that being continued. Ill health retirement has been a matter for us as well, and again we're seeing significant improvement in processes around that, supporting staff and reduction in time that's been taken. And we're obviously monitoring issues such as access to education and training, leadership development, because that's so fundamental and important to keeping the workforce safe, but also supporting the organisation for transformational change.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Could you just rehearse the assurance you're giving us about the strategic workforce plan? You've seen a draft, you're carrying a workshop. Just a little bit more, please. This has been an ongoing theme for a large number of
Apologies, Chair. I did finish too early. Both strategic workforce plan and the people strategy have been a matter of interest for us. We've had additional and extraordinary meetings so that we can rehearse and discuss with not only the Scotland colleagues, but SP officials. And we are expecting that to come to the next authority meeting, so that we have that in November, both documents. We're also looking at how the data will be reported, so that we can then have evidence of effectiveness and we're sufficiently assured on the outcomes. So we are expecting these to come in our November meeting.
Thank you very much. And I'm glad it's going to come to you and therefore to the board within this calendar year.
Oh, so apologies, Chair, for not being clear. We are expecting it to come to the board in November. We are expecting it. We're having a special people committee so that we can consider the final document, but we will have had sight of that before, so we can give feedback. So we are expecting that to come for approval to authority in November.
Thank you. Although it seems, as you know, a very technical matter, the strategic workforce plan is critical for the skill mix and the competence mix of the workforce of Police Scotland to deal with the current and emerging threats and harms and the priorities. So I'm very pleased if we can have that in November before the board, but your committee would have considered it in detail before that. Thank you very much. Any questions to the Chair of People Committee? Thank you. The last report is from Grant McCrae. Grant is reporting on behalf of Mary Pitt-Casely on the Audit, Risk and Assurance Committee. Grant.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'm reporting on behalf of Mary, who's not able to be here today. We had two items of business that we considered at the meeting on the 13th of September. First of all, Grant Thornton's annual audit report. It's important probably for members to be aware that this is Grant Thornton's first year as our external auditors, replacing the Audit Scotland's own internal team. They outlined their findings, and the findings were well received by the committee, and it seemed to have gone very smoothly indeed, which is not an insignificant challenge when you've got a change in auditor. We then considered the updated annual report and accounts, which we'd seen in draft earlier in the year, and followed through the changes from the earlier draft. So in conclusion, although the actual annual audit report and the draft annual report and accounts will be taken in private session later because we can't actually make them public until they're presented to Parliament, we are recommending both the annual audit report and the draft annual report and accounts to the authority for approval.
Thank you very much indeed. Any questions? Any questions from any comments from yourself, Chief Executive, about the annual report and accounts?
I'm going to touch base on it in my own update, if I may, but nothing to add to to Grant's comments. Okay,
if there are no further comments or questions for the board members, I'm going to move on now to the Deputy Chief Constable Designate's report. And before I invite that, say thank you very much for all your work over this period of your office, and thank you for the team around you for supporting you over this period. Really much appreciated. So I look forward to your report to us. Thank you.
Chair, thank you. My written report, which has been circulated and is part of the meeting pack this morning, references the joint submission and evidence session with the authority to the Criminal Justice Committee, underlining the significant challenges which policing in Scotland faces, and we've already touched on some of those this morning. So I will return to these pressing and important areas shortly. I would first, though, touch upon some of the vital policing being delivered by committed, compassionate and professional officers and staff every day, just some of which is highlighted in my report. I will begin with a number of arrests in relation to the death of Anthony Ferns in the Thornley Bank area of Glasgow in April 2019. 4 men, aged between 37 and 67, earlier this month appeared at Glasgow Sheriff Court, charged in connection with Mr Ferns' murder. In a separate case, at the end of August, the twin brothers Alexander and Robert McKellar were sentenced in relation to the death of Anthony Parsons. Mr Parsons was a much-loved husband, dad and granddad who lived in Tillicoultry. He was 63 when he was hit by a car driven by Alexander McKellar, whilst on a charity cycle ride between his home and Fort William, and that was in September 2017. The brothers hid Mr Parsons' body, and despite extensive inquiries at the time, it was only in December 2020 when additional information led to the arrest of both McKellar brothers. Further searches were carried out, and in January 2021, human remains were found in a remote area close to a farm near the A82. These were identified as Mr Parsons. Alexander McKellar was sentenced to 12 years imprisonment, having pleaded guilty to the culpable homicide of Mr Parsons and of attempting to defeat the ends of justice. Robert McKellar was sentenced to 5 years for attempting to defeat the ends of justice. The brutal and uncaring actions of these men left Mr Parsons' family distraught. I pay tribute to their resilience and dignity through this horrendous ordeal. I hope the arrests and court outcomes in relation to Alexander and Robert McKellar provide answers and provide some comfort. I thank the local community for their assistance during this complex investigation. The detection of homicides based on strong relationships between local officers and our communities and professional investigative work by detectives is an area where Police Scotland delivers high levels of operational competence and compassion for victims of crime and their loved ones. Our commitment to seeking justice is underlined by our world-leading detection rate. Our determination to hold offenders to account for the most serious of crimes is also evidenced by ongoing enforcement action in relation to the supply of illegal drugs, which again is outlined in my written report. Police operations in Glasgow, Edinburgh and the Lothians earlier this month resulted in significant quantities of drugs, cash and drugs production equipment being seized, as well as a number of arrests made. Working with the Serious and Organised Crime Task Force and other partners and agencies locally, nationally and internationally, Police Scotland is determined to maintain our strong track record of dismantling organised crime groups and holding those who deal in death and misery in our communities to account. At the same time, we continue to play a contributory role in supporting those affected by addiction. My report, and you've touched on this, Chair, my report outlines how our programme of training and equipping all operational officers with the life-saving nasal spray naloxone is now complete, with around 12,500 officers carrying this first aid kit. Naloxone has now been used by officers on hundreds of occasions right across Scotland, with positive outcomes in the overwhelming majority of incidents. And there is no doubt that our officers have saved many lives. The preservation of life goes right to the heart of policing, and it's worth reflecting on these important interventions for individuals and for their loved ones. Police Scotland's response to illegal drugs underlines both our commitment to our vital law enforcement duties and also our broad remit in law to improve the well-being of individuals and communities. And I am hugely grateful to our officers and staff whose compassionate and values-based policing contributes to that shared mission. And this is demonstrated by our colleagues day in, day out, right across the country. Police officers and staff play a vital role in ensuring that Scotland is and remains a safe place to live and work. Despite historically low levels of overall crime, we know that reporting continues to grow in respect of sexual offending, and we continue to work with victims to ensure that victims have the confidence to come forward, knowing that they will be treated with dignity and respect and the circumstances professionally investigated. We also know that cyber-enabled crime, including sexual offending with a cyber element and fraud, has increased and has increased significantly compared to pre-pandemic levels. Recent and upcoming legislative changes also have significant implications for policing in terms of training, implementation and enforcement. This has been demonstrated by the Age of Criminal Responsibility Scotland Act, the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Act, the Domestic Abuse Protection Scotland Act and the licensing of short-term lets legislation. Police Scotland also continues to respond to recommendations from reviews and inspections. At the same time, the cost of living crisis and pressure across all public services increases vulnerability and displaces need onto policing, and this is evidenced through increasing contacts with Police Scotland. I see this as an indicator of the strong relationship our public has with policing as a service of first and last resort, and indeed as a gateway to other services. People who contact Police Scotland for help continue to report high levels of overall satisfaction. Equally, there is evidence through the Scottish Government's Household Survey that policing in Scotland is a highly trusted public institution sitting just behind the health service. So all of this means that policing in Scotland is required to respond to increasing and increasingly complex need and demand. I recognise and pay tribute to the dedication, professionalism and ongoing goodwill of our officers and staff in doing so. It's therefore right that officers and staff are fairly recognised and rewarded. I thank the unions and staff associations who have contributed to the constructive discussions about pay awards for officers and staff. And members, Chair, you referenced this earlier, members will know that an agreement has been reached with officers, and today we learned that staff have also agreed an award after a ballot which closed yesterday. The 7% headline agreement means police officers and police staff in Scotland will receive pay increases in line with other key public sector workers, such as teachers and firefighters, with a total uplift of just over 12% across the last 2 years. This is well deserved. Funding allocations to Police Scotland have been better than the flat cash profile outlined in the resource spending review. However, because around 85% of our revenue budget is spent on pay, we recognise delivering funding which keeps pace with pay awards to help public servants to meet the increased cost of living during periods of high inflation is an enormous challenge for government. The government rightly expects public services to be as efficient as possible, and policing in Scotland has already returned more than £200 million to the public purse every year compared to legacy arrangements. This has been achieved through significant reductions in chief officers, in senior officers and police staff members, as well as through efficiencies and improved working practices in our single force. However, the revenue budget provided by the Scottish Government in 23-24 did represent a real terms cut, which has not allowed policing to maintain our workforce at the levels of previous years and at the same time make those pay awards. So our officer establishment is now around 16,600 and we're reducing police staff costs proportionately. As we have consistently highlighted over a period of months, hard choices are necessary and are now being taken to deliver effective policing within available funding. Of necessity, we are working to achieve savings, and we coordinate this through the Policing Our Communities programme led jointly by DCC Graham and DCO Page. Policing has a duty to be candid about such choices and their implications, and Policing Our Communities is supported by a schedule of ongoing communications and engagement with officers and staff, key partners and the public we serve. As I outlined during last month's board meeting, we have paused all police support staff recruitment, except for some business critical areas, such as our contact centres and custody suites. We are rigorously managing overtime spend. Very senior officers are scrutinising overtime costs and taking action to reduce spend. This is the right thing for the budget, but it's also the right thing for the well-being of our officers who need and deserve appropriate rest. We are reviewing our senior officer command structures, and we are reviewing our support services to ensure that our structures are as lean as possible so that service levels are protected as far as possible. Along with this important discipline and fiscal rigour, we are taking action to build capacity and reduce demand so that we continue to respond to the public by prioritising issues which present the greatest threat, harm and risk. One example of this is a proportionate response to crime pilot in the North East or A Division. The pilot will enable local officers to focus on crimes that have proportionate lines of inquiry, and by so doing, they can give more time to local concerns and local priorities. We are absolutely clear that we want people to continue to report crime. All reports are subject of a threat, harm, risk, investigation, vulnerability and engagement, a Thrive assessment. Every call and every caller will be assessed against those Thrive criteria, and this assessment will be key to deciding whether a crime is suitable for the pilot process. But of course, we will also continue to analyse crime reports so that we respond effectively to any emerging trends. The pilot will be fully evaluated, and we are listening to how communities and our partners in the North East feel about it. We are, though, clear that our partners and the people of Scotland rightly expect policing to respond to incidents appropriately and proportionately in a way which prioritises vulnerability and keeps people safe. The police estate is also an area where efficiencies and improvements to buildings in the wrong place or in poor conditions can and must deliver savings, and further necessary cost reduction is planned in relation to police buildings. We shared our outline proposals to accelerate the disposal of a further 30 police buildings with Resources Committee last week, and we're now developing detailed plans for that work. We understand and we are sensitive to community concerns around closing police buildings, but it's important to underline that as we consolidate our estate, we now have over 60 co-locations with partners, providing more sustainable, more modern and safer workspaces for our people. And we have great examples of successful partnerships in the North East, in Perthshire, Forth Valley and in Ayrshire, amongst others. And this approach will continue to be an important part of ensuring that policing in Scotland is sustainable. At the same time, we've enhanced local policing by providing all of our officers with mobile devices which allow them to stay connected in local communities, reducing the need to return to police buildings to deal with paperwork. Police Scotland shares the authority's determination to deliver a balanced budget in 23-24, and hard choices will be taken to that end. No decisions are taken lightly, and we rightly have a clear focus on driving organisational efficiency in order to protect service delivery as far as possible. However, as we have already made clear, what we do may take longer in some instances or may need to be done differently, and the levels of service that we provide to the public relating to some issues will inevitably reduce. Chair, we remain absolutely focused on our core mission to keep the people of Scotland safe and to improve the lives and well-being of our communities now and into the future. We greatly value the active oversight and scrutiny of the authority, and we will, of course, continue to engage and consult with the authority, with other partners, and with the public about the strategic changes we will be making in the months ahead. Of necessity, and as part of our commitment to delivering a balanced budget, we are closely assessing our officer recruitment profile for the remainder of 23-24. However, last Wednesday, I welcomed around 200 new probationary constables to Police Scotland during an oath of office ceremony at our headquarters in Tullyallen. This was an important event to underline the expectations and values of our vital public service to our newest colleagues who will deploy to serve communities across Scotland at the conclusion of their initial training. And Chair, I'll pause there and with my fellow deputies seek to answer any questions from yourself or from board members. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very comprehensive report, and thank you for your very clear and explicit commitments on the closing the gap on eliminating the budget deficit. We'll come back to that. Just a couple of points from me. On the lock zone, sometimes success goes under remarked. I think that's a remarkable achievement to have had the policy, discussed the policy, argued the policy within Police Scotland and wider, delivered it safely, and then he actually have some outcomes and also an independent evaluation of it. So congratulations to all concerned. I think that's a major achievement, and it's an exemplar about how new technology, in this case a nasal spray, is introduced, not without controversy. Those of us who look back know there were some pretty tough times in that, but the outcome was great benefit. The second point before I bring in my other board members is about, forgive me if I haven't got the word right, the police warnings, informal warnings. I had a very interesting and comprehensive briefing from DCC Malcolm Graham into my office about this, and I would like to know how that can be wider discussed and what forum that could be better understood, because this is a clear policing tactic, and the reason it was made explicit in the briefing to me is that you wish to, and society wishes to decriminalise some aspect in order to save the pressure on both courts and our prison service where it's inappropriate to pursue that. And this is my summary. It's not a very elegant summary. So if I could ask through you, DCC Malcolm Graham, to express how that might be a more public conversation and how that briefing might be better aired.
Well, thanks very much for the acknowledgement of the work. We were aware that there was a number of specific incidents, I think, that led to a focus of attention on the use of recorded police warnings. And I think the first step of that, from our perspective, was the request for the board to get more information. I'd be very keen to work in partnership with the Scottish Police Authority to see how we can produce what I think has been a successful series of public information leaflets and turn one around about recorded police warnings and publish it. Yeah, I'm happy to say a little bit more about that now if it's helpful, or I'm happy to do the work off table and bring it back for another discussion either through a committee or through that kind of vehicle into the public domain, either way.
Thank you, and I would be very much welcome that. So what I would say, maybe we talk it through our staff together. We have a publication together, and I would like to see some form of public seminar where we can explore the very significant public policy issues around this area and get people better understood about what your approach is. And I believe it's a very progressive approach, but not everybody agrees with that, so I'd like that in the public domain. I would ask our Chief Executive team to take that forward, and maybe within the Policing Performance Committee to be aware of a joint seminar together. Thank you for that. So thank you for both of those, and thank you whilst I'm speaking to you for your attendance at the terrorism conference in Washington and upping the skills and competence within policing. Again, could I just ask through you, Deputy Taylor, if that could be explained a little bit more about how common that is, about that kind of international cooperation on learning?
No, absolutely. I think the board are very well briefed on the International Development and Innovation Unit, the board that I now chair, which has SPA membership at both official and member level. And I'm really grateful for the high level of support for the international work, much of which is funded either through the Foreign and Commonwealth Office or through the Scottish Government directly from the board, because it's a hugely important part of our responsibility as a global policing citizen, and also I think the correct, appropriate projection of the leadership and strength that we have in Police Scotland to influence internationally, working in partnership with a whole range of other organisations at UK level, one of whom the Director General, Graham Bigger, is joining us today, and we'll hear more about hugely important interfaces with the international network of liaison officers that the NCA provides as but one example on the operational side. And there is a plethora of work that is ongoing, as I say, mostly directly funded, where Police Scotland has the opportunity to provide that leadership and experience capacity which there is a strong desire for across the globe, and aligned with the funding streams that tend to come from some of the political direction in terms of international influence that's desirable for either the UK or Scotland at both those levels. Specifically round about leadership and counter-terrorism, I think there is a particularly sustained and special relationship that Scotland formed with colleagues in the United States, and particularly the FBI, following the atrocity of Flight Pan Am 103 and the Lockerbie bombing back in 1988. And that then developed through conversations post 9/11 in 2001 into a desire to develop a much more strategic and focused leadership programme around about relationship building and counter-terrorism, which involves a series of nations who already cooperate politically at the highest level in terms of sharing information and intelligence. And this is very much focused on law enforcement and other intelligence partners, and it's been hugely successful. And I think it's to the great credit of officers and leaders in Scotland that we are at the forefront of leading that work internationally.
Thank you very much. I'm going to open up to board members. I've got Jane Ryder first.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, this is something that actually is not covered in your report, but a high level of public interest. I think recently, events elsewhere, we have a small number of specialist firearms officers. Thankfully, I think we've had very few, perhaps only one fatality, but I just wondered, in light of events elsewhere, whether you could give us some assurance of the morale and whether there was any disquiet from yourself or from the officers in relation to events elsewhere.
Jane, thank you. Very pertinent and very topical question. And we have been liaising very closely with colleagues in the Metropolitan Police Service to understand the particular circumstances that pertain to the events which have recently in the Metropolitan Police Service led to specialist firearms officers taking a particular decision. I'll pass to Jane in a second. DCC Connors in a second is a sort of senior leader for firearms in Scotland. But I'd just like to say a couple of things first of all. The first point that I would like to make and would like to reinforce is how grateful I am to those officers who, as volunteers, step forward to take on the additional responsibilities and individual risk that comes with the carriage of a police-issue firearm. They are rigorously selected, they are highly trained, and it's right that they are supported by senior leaders within Police Scotland. And that is certainly my intention and the intention of my senior colleagues. Jane, I may come to you just to talk more specifically about the mood within our teams at the moment, if I can.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you very much for the question, the concern as well for Scotland, but also our officers in particular. I think it's fair to say that there was a level of concern that can be completely understood. There was a very measured and thoughtful response by the officers within Scotland to try and understand what the position was. We didn't have any periods of reflection from our firearms staff. There was really good engagement by the senior leadership team quickly with officers to be able to understand. So morale, I would suggest, is good, but there is ongoing watching concern into the situation in London, as with everybody. In relation to our links with London, there was a number of goal groups held over that weekend, and DCC Spears was part of that. I've picked it up as part of the business as usual. The goal groups sit at a tactical level, understanding what the requirements from London are, what the mutual aid requirements are, what the skills are required from London. The National Police Chiefs Council group also sat, which I sat on, which was much more about the wider impact and collectively as policing, how we look at that. So the position at the moment, the distance of Police Scotland in terms of being able to deploy, it is not something we can do quickly. Surrounding areas supported London, as you will have seen in the news. The position in London is starting to stabilise. The goal groups have continued, and we sit on all of those groups to ensure that we are fully sighted in Scotland as to what is going on. And that position remains. And as it stabilises in London, the requests from mutual aid coming up as far as Scotland are starting to stabilise, and it's predominantly being supplied by the forces in the UK. But thank you for your concern. As I say, morale is good, concern is there, and we will continue to watch it and monitor it and link in with our national colleagues as well across the UK.
Thank you very much. Michelle Miller.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Fiona, for your report. The commitment comes across with a lot of authenticity in terms of police officers and staff, and I think the description of the work throughout the report is really encouraging. I think my questions relate more to the kind of financial circumstances that you described towards the end of the report. You mentioned priorities, but I don't think that we as a board have actually seen articulated in any kind of clear way your proposed prioritisation in relation to policing in Scotland, given the very difficult financial circumstances. And in March, when the budget was set, we all knew that it wasn't a budget that was ideal in terms of wanting to do everything that Police Scotland wanted to do. But we were clear in terms of your assurances that it was a budget that was deliverable, or a service that was deliverable within the budget, and that it would require those priorities. What I'm less clear about is what those priorities are, how they have been arrived at, and as importantly, what the implications of that prioritisation will be in terms of a service that may be delivered to a lesser extent in order to allow for the higher priority, so that can be communicated clearly, and people, if not necessarily happy with it, can at least understand the circumstances. That's the first issue, which is about us having some real clarity about what those priorities are and what the implications are. The second thing, and this is, I think, where it links as much to the policing performance report and the resources report, the assurances that we had in March were around, yes, we can manage this budget, but the narrative since then has been there is insufficient money for us to deliver the service. When our performance levels reduce, it's because there are insufficient funds. 6 months into the financial year, we are in a position where those assurances really haven't kind of come to fruition, really. But we're getting further assurances in terms of the ability of Police Scotland to manage an increased gap in the second 6 months. So I'm slightly concerned and anxious that what we couldn't do over a year, we're now going to have to do more of, and in a shorter space of time. So I'd just like to understand a little bit more about how the assurances that we're getting today in terms of the second 6 months of the year are different from the assurances that we received in March for the 12 months. And linked to that, I suppose, the inevitability of the time lapse between March and now, and the fact that the budget position has got worse rather than having a report to us that says we are not on track, we're delivering on these priorities, but we're on track to meet the budget for the end of the year. So it's those three kind of related issues that I would really welcome some more detail on from you, if you wouldn't mind.
Michelle, thank you for the questions. I will, if I can, provide an overview in terms of Police Scotland's strategic approach and commitment, and then I will pass to DCC Graham just to explore the issue of prioritisation with the board members in a bit more detail, in the sequence of events that we will go through before we determine ultimately that prioritisation profile. while, and then I'll come to the DCO just to talk about the financial grip required in the final 6 months of the year. However, before I do any of that, what I would like to do is just compliment the competence and the grip and the courage that sits within our financial, the CFO's portfolio at the moment, for being very robust and very challenging, and certainly bringing to the attention of every single senior member of Police Scotland the financial circumstances that pertain to the organisation at the moment. Grant referred earlier to signing off last year's accounts, the clean bill of health from a new external auditor, and that is fairly and squarely as a consequence of the competence which sits within the CFO's function. So I would like to recognise that. So there is significant work ongoing at the moment, Michelle, under the auspices of policing our communities in order to drive efficiencies out organisationally over the remaining 6 months of this financial year. One of the key areas that we do want to push into, and we're doing that by means of the strategic efficiency review and reinvestment, possibly less of the reinvestment now, more of the review, is to push that into corporate support within Police Scotland. And we will begin to do that imminently once the contract is awarded. Now, what that will enable us to do is understand where we can drive efficiencies from the support that is provided internally to Police Scotland, as I referenced in my report, to give us more flexibility in terms of maintaining external service delivery. So that is a really key piece of work for us, and that is a piece of work that we will be taking forward in the near future. That doesn't just sit in terms of the DCO's portfolio. That support piece actually sits right across the organisation. There are further, without any doubt, further efficiencies that we can drive out across the organisation to enable us to become as efficient as we possibly can. We are also looking to accelerate elements of transformation activity around modernised contact and engagement. We've talked through the auspices of the performance report, and indeed you raised this morning about and indeed I did in my speaking notes as well, the increased demand on policing in Scotland at the moment. And we do believe that there are more effective ways of dealing with that demand to deliver a similar level of service, but not perhaps in the, it's still an analogue system in a digital world. There is more that we can do there, and that is certainly a key element of accelerating the work to transform our organisation, to release capacity again to reinvest into frontline policing services. So there is work for us to do to understand exactly what that prioritisation should look like. That's work that Malcolm is taking forward at the moment. I may pause and just bring Malcolm in around prioritisation, and David, come back to yourself around the scale of the budgetary challenge and the mitigation activity that we will look to bring forward over the remaining 6 months of the year. Malcolm.
Thank you, Fiona. I'll try and add to what Fiona's already said. Firstly, I understand the importance, I think we all do, of the issues in terms of bringing the budget back online for the year that we're in, and the mitigating steps that we're having to take to do that. I would just highlight a number of things about the risks that were flagged at the point that the budget was passed. A number of those have become issues. Some of that was, to an extent, potentially anticipated. And as they become issues, we take action against them. So it has been a more rapidly changing environment in terms of some of the pressures than perhaps would have been anticipated in a best case scenario. Alongside that, the timelines in terms of decision making set against an annualised budget cycle were extremely tight. As members will know, we moved towards reducing the police officer numbers in the latter part of last financial year, so that when we arrived at a position of the 1st of April, we had already moved to 16,600 officers from over 17,200. Clearly, with the space of time that happened, in a budget cycle that is only announced to us around about Christmas 2022 and confirmed through the parliamentary process in February of 2023, that gives a very, very short space of time to put in place effective strategic transformation to reorganise an operating model for that level of change. So inevitably, I think there's going to be a little bit of catch-up as we work at pace and with some urgency to do that work now. Alongside the mitigating measures and the prioritisations that have been in place for this year, and I'll say a little bit about what's already come out, I do fully understand why there is a strong, legitimate appetite to see a more comprehensive picture of, well, what are the options and what will service level reductions look like in different scenarios. Without knowing what the budget is going to be for next year, we are now committed at pace to working on such a product that by the time we get through to the tail end of this financial year, we'll be in a much better position than we were when these announcements were made last year to look at different scenarios around about the workforce as we move into next financial year. During the course of this year, we've already made announcements about a change to the roads policing model. We've talked at length about the mitigating measures we've put in around about preserving our response to treble 9 calls at the expense of our service times around about 101 and non-emergencies. And Fiona has already spoken at some length in her earlier speaking note to the report around about the North East pilot in terms of a proportionate response to crime. These are all measures which demonstrate the strategic intent to focus on preserving high threat, high risk and vulnerability as services and inevitably deprioritise some other services. Now, the frustration that I think I sense in terms of there not being a greater level of detail about what that actually means, I suppose to address on two fronts. One, refer back to my earlier comments that more of that will come through as we do the higher level strategic work that will redesign the shape of the whole organisation during the latter part of this year. And secondly, some of it will not be specific, such as the breadth and complexity of the service, and I think Alistair Hay referred to this earlier. Some of it will undoubtedly be felt through a gradual but noticeable decline in some things taking longer to do, in performance dropping against some areas. And of course, we want to be deliberate in the decisions that we make as to where that happens, but some of it will inevitably come through in a broader range of different areas that we will track and monitor and have to adjust as we go, such as the level of change that we're putting in place. So we can commit to bringing back more detail and then being able to not only ensure that the board are fully briefed on what those plans, options and decisions will be as we make them, but at this stage, we haven't made those decisions. We're working at pace to do that, and it would be premature, therefore, I think, to speculate, given the serious impact of what some of those changes are likely to be.
Thanks for that, those responses, both Fiona and Malcolm. And I appreciate, some of these things do take time. And I think, Fiona, you talked about a big piece of work around efficiency that was going to be taken forward in the near future, and then the work, the prioritisation that you're talking about, Malcolm, will come back to us in the future. So I'm assuming that from that we're talking not necessarily in relation to that being a tool for managing the budget for this year, that actually it's going to be a longer term issue, because the type of work that you're describing is strategic, it's big, it's a long-term thing. So that's, I might be wrong, but that's what I'm assuming. My concern then will be that given that we only have 6 months left and that the situation is getting worse in terms of what Resources Committee has reported to us, I'm particularly concerned about the extent to which the type of savings that you're going to need to make to bring the budget online back online for this year is actually going to result in some slash and burn potentially, and possibly make decisions that for the long term might not be the best ones, but because you're left with nowhere to go in terms of trying to bring the budget back on track. So I'd like to understand a little bit more about what capacity you have within the system over this next 6 months, if it's not those big long-term strategic transformational pieces of work that are going to safeguard the service, but at the same time bring the budget back in line.
Michelle, thank you. And I will hand to David in a second just to give you that more, if you like, detailed overview of some of the financial mitigation activity that we will be taking forward. But of course, you're right. Malcolm spoke about the need to, transform our organisation, to redraw, if you like, the size, the shape of policing in Scotland as we move into what will inevitably be a very challenging year in 24-25. So some of the work that we're engaged in at the moment will drive benefit this year, but the majority of the strategic activity that we are engaging in will drive benefit 24-25 and beyond. So in terms of the short term, that's where the leadership grip and the management grip really comes in, Michelle. This is in terms of, utilising the leadership skills that Alan brings to the table to really drive down the overtime spend across the remainder of this year. We are looking at the issues of and we're doing this in a very, very considered way. We do have individuals within our organisation who are on fixed-term contracts. So is there any leeway that we can, look at the numbers of individuals on fixed-term contracts in the short term who are sitting in areas of the business which does not impact significantly on the prioritised transformation programme, for example. And that's what I mean about looking very hard at the internal support services that we have within Police Scotland. But that is all done in the context of we know that we have to retain the capacity to engage in properly strategic transformational change, both in terms of those large ICT projects that we very much want to support and sustain, such as body-worn videos, such as modernised contact and engagement, but also to engage in internal transformation around service design. So there are options for us in the short term. We are being very, very cautious around undermining organisational capacity, which has been hard fought for and hard won over the last decade. And we all appreciate, we all have a memory of the amalgamation of the 8 forces back in 2013, where there was a slash and burn approach taken to particularly police staff colleagues, and as a consequence, we lost an incredible amount of capacity that has taken us a decade to rebuild. So we are very conscious of that. The activity that we're taking in the short term is very thoughtful. Clearly, some of it will be suboptimal. Malcolm's already alluded to the fact that we knew there were risks when we that we own and we co-own in some instances. But we appreciated that there were risks when we signed off the budget. But the situation over the last 6 months, I think, has been very, 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 very challenging and possibly not anticipated by any of us. Now, again, in terms of that, what can we do in the shorter term? And I'm sure David will speak to this without undermining our organisational ability going forward. Is we don't 85% of our the finance that comes into Police Scotland goes on pay, as you know. However, we do have a non-pay budget. So I've asked my colleagues line by line to go through that non-pay budget. Anything which is not committed, what can we knock out? So those are the sort of shorter term activities that we're taking forward, as well as those longer term, genuinely transformational activities. David, I wonder if I can maybe just ask you to add a wee bit more to the financial challenge and how we're approaching it.
Thanks, Fiona, and thanks for the question, Michelle. Entirely reasonable in terms of the budget commitments that were made, where we are after the first 4 months in terms of, as Grant's already said, 18.9 million was what we committed to in terms of the measures that we were going to take. And then 1 month into that programme, we've gone the wrong way. We're up to 19.2 million. So that means what was a 8-month challenge is now a 7-month challenge, but a bigger challenge. So that's the reality of it. You're quite right in terms of if you don't deliver on the commitments you've already made, and those commitments are deeper in nature in terms of what is the prioritisation, what is it you're going to stop, what is it you're going to do less of or slower. If we're not making those decisions which are having the effect in some of the areas, then where we have to move to is not quite slash and burn, but I know exactly what you mean. We start looking at real short-term contributions to try and save funding. So the non-paid budget, it isn't particularly large. It's 200 million in the context of our budget. We've done very detailed line-by-line reviews and stripped out the monies that we can at the moment. There's still a little bit more work to do in a couple of areas there. What I would say is this isn't kind of like to do money. This is stuff like core training for people in different departments to do their jobs. So if we're stripping back on that training, it actually weakens capability in the organisation. So yes, we can strip back that money and we do save money in year, but what we're effectively saying in areas is that we'll push the training into next year. And this is kind of core training for IT, for finance, for P&D and stuff like that. That's the capability of our people, our ability to manage people. So we're doing a big piece of work around that. We're increasing authorisation levels across the force in terms of who can give the authority to do overtime, who can give the authority to go and stay in a hotel, who can give authority to do anything, basically. So we're stripping back the authority levels on that. We're also looking hard now into the reform budget. So reform budget, the board will remember, used to be 25 million that was provided by Scottish Government. It was baselined into our budget for this financial year at 20 million. We had transferred £5 million of our revenue funding, core revenue funding, across into transformation to prop up the transformation budget effectively. What we've done as part of the original plan, we said we would move £3 million back across from reform into revenue. That was part of our original commitment. We've done that. We've now moved another £2 million out of the reform budget. So we've moved £5 million to kind of help that budget challenge. As we've already said, the budget has gone the wrong way. It's a 19.2 million challenge now. So what we're doing is a line-by-line review of the entire transformation programme. So this is all the change we need to do, and we're planning to do to deliver the capacity improvements. And as we've said previously, if you reduce your workforce, one way of offsetting that in terms of protecting service delivery is to increase your capacity. So the work we're looking at now is decreasing commitments and resources into that reform and transformation programme. So we're going through line by line and effectively, as Fiona's touched on, looking at the resources that are contractually funded in there, looking at the impact of if we take those contracts out now, what do we pause, what do we stop, what's the operational impact of it? Because of the size of the challenge, 19.2 million in 7 months, we're looking quite hard into that. Where we are continuing to protect currently, as we said at the Criminal Justice Committee a week or so ago, is we're still looking to try and protect the body-worn video programme, which is underpinned by the desk programme and a couple of core other programmes, but we're right up against that now in terms of where we are. So as we're in September, which is effectively period 6 for us, if we don't see movement on some of those core choices you were talking about to start to bring that number down, we will bite very hard into that transformation programme. And that's the sort of slash and burn you're talking about, because of, yes, we can stop things, we can save some money, but we're effectively plugging a gap, and it's a non-recurring gap, so this is really important. If we take all these actions to try and hold the budget, that will be a 23-24 effort that we're doing, and that's the detailed proposal. And there's a number of quite serious operational decisions that are being considered at the moment by my deputy colleagues about if we stop certain things, we could contribute in the short term. That might help us get over the line in 23-24. What it will present us with as we go into 24-25 is a carried forward debt from all the recurring things that don't recur. So we'll only have half the budget plugged with recurring items. The other half of it will be the slash and burn items you're talking about. That gives us a debt to work with, so the 24-25 budget challenge then becomes 24-25 in itself, which is a huge challenge, with a carry forward of the recurring and non-recurring items. So we're looking at that as well. We are literally looking everywhere, and everyone's working extremely hard to try and find basically any penny. It used to be every pound's a prisoner, it's every penny is a prisoner, and I kid you not, in terms of what we're looking to try and do.
Slightly concerned what I hear here, but we'll pick this up through the Resources Committee and else elsewhere from how you are saying you're approaching it, which I think sounded different from how the Deputy Chief Constable said she was approaching it, which is a whole system view, rather than taking major programs out or using reform money to plug a gap. But can we come back to that in more detail in the committee areas? But I want to keep on this theme of around the budget, priorities and service levels. So I've got a number of speakers. I'll come to Katerina. You're gonna, if it's not about that, just skip and we'll come back to it. Is it about around this area?
It is about this, actually. Yes, sorry, I'm conscious. I think Fiona wanted to come in ahead of me, but I'm just going to say my piece. It's probably an observation, and it does link in quite neatly to the whole prioritization element, because the one observation I have, and it is encouraging to kind of hear around how the budget constraints will impact on service, and I appreciate it's a really, really complex picture. So it's not as simple as saying we're just going to stop this, this, and this, and this. So fully understand that. I suppose the one observation I have is that, of course, I understand Police Scotland does have operational independence, but it does not operate in a vacuum. I mean, this is a theme that we have explored quite extensively, that actually something that Police Scotland does or stops doing will inevitably impact potentially in other agencies, other areas of work. And we know that that works exactly the other way around as well, that challenges in social work or NHS will generally lead to some ripple effects affecting Police Scotland and levels of demand. So that is something that's really well explored. So I suppose a challenge for me is that the more sooner we can articulate, Police Scotland can articulate the impacts of the current budget constraints on service levels and communicate that to partners, the sooner as a whole system, other partners can understand what that might mean for them. And I do really believe that this joined up picture is incredibly important now, because we know that other agencies are facing very, very similar challenges. So I suppose it's an observation, it's a concern I have.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take another couple of questions. Fiona, you wanted to comment about this general theme? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. So three questions. First of all, when would you expect the budget to be balanced this year? So when do you expect to see that come into balance within this financial year? The other question, I've listened carefully to what's been said and I've read the papers. So looking at the revised performance framework in terms of the total number of non-sexual crimes of violence, the detection rate has reduced. But I think I'm right in hearing the budget actually hasn't been reduced in the first 3 or 4 months, because there still has been overspend. And also there's a commitment to prioritisation. So I'm interested in what steps are being taken to protect areas such as the crimes of violence, so that detection rates can stay the same. But I'm also looking at the performance framework where it says there is variation. So is what we saw at the drop in the first part of the year just natural variation, and you would expect that to revert? And then the third question is about monitoring and how you're going to monitor this, Fiona. So you've talked about a new roads policing model. I don't know if there is a correlation between roads policing and road deaths, or roads policing and road traffic accident, but how will you monitor it almost in real time, so that you, when you're changing your priorities, you can see the impact and then make a decision either to rebalance your priorities or to keep going because what you're seeing is an unacceptable outcome?
Fiona, thank you. And I think the final element of the question you asked very much touches on the observations that Katrina made. Actually, this is a really complex system with multiple interdependencies, which is why we don't want to move to any knee-jerk decisions in terms of dialing down service levels, because there are potentially consequences from that. There will be consequences. There is no need. There is no doubt. Rather, there will be consequences from the decisions which we take. But we want to, in as as best we can, understand what those consequences are. Now, in terms of the piece around Police Scotland creating demand for other organisations in terms of some of the decisions that we take, we are also in the space at the moment of working very hard with other organisations to reduce some of the demand that comes from them into Police Scotland, mental health being one, overtime spend as a consequence of court citations being another. So there is a lot of work with partners, both, if you like, push and pull into and out of the organisation to help us understand how we protect service levels, but at the same time make reasonable sort of asks of partners to support us in doing that, but equally don't do anything which sort of either inadvertently or because we are rash in our thinking has an impact on other agencies. So if we move that, then I'll come to David ultimately just to talk about when we think the technicalities of when we think the budget will be balanced, Fiona. But in terms of the performance stats that we are seeing at the moment, clearly, and I said this in my speaking notes this morning, our core mission is to keep people safe and to improve the safety and well-being of people and communities across the country. And crime and criminality is certainly an element of that. But again, you will know, and again, this is why this is such a complex area. The interdependencies are clear to all of us. We also respond to mental health, mental sort of well-being. We support the NHS. We intervene when people are in crisis across the country, whether that is as a result of criminality or as a result of other circumstances which are impacting on their lives at the moment. So yes, that overtime spend still was very high at the start of the year. We understand, with the benefit of the granularity of sort of fiscal reporting that we're able to take advantage of, that it was too high, that we need to dial it down. Again, that is part of the reprioritisation work that is ongoing at the moment that Malcolm has already spoken to. But I do think that the reduction in police officer numbers, the increasing and increasingly complex demand has had an impact on detection rates. And I think I'll pass to Jane in a minute because I know Jane is doing a lot of work on all of our behalf to understand how we do support the detection of serious criminality, serious crimes that occur across the country, back to the piece about threat, risk and harm and protecting the vulnerable. But there is no doubt that the current situation that we are in as an organisation is now having an impact on elements of our performance. Malcolm again has spoken about the deprioritisation of 101 in order that we can prioritise 999. Jane, I'll maybe ask you to come in on the detection rates piece and then I'll pass back to David just to answer that question, Fiona, on when we anticipate that the budget will be back in a balanced state, so to speak. Jane?
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you very much for the question. It links into a number of the questions and comments that have been made so far. I think one of the things is to link back to one of the comments that was made by DCC Graham in terms of the officer number reductions, knowing what the projected officer numbers and coming down from our original establishment to the new establishment meant that actually we carried a significant number of vacancies across the organisation in order to enable that we would be able to meet that new establishment when it came in. So actually what we had was a significant vacancy rate in order to make sure that we weren't recruiting into posts that we knew we were going to have to exit out because the police officer structures, are different. As a result of that, what we saw is increased complexity, workloads onto staff in a number of different areas. What that also meant was that it increased overtime in trying to meet the demand that was coming in with reduced officers. So you also saw an increase in overtime spend. And what that has done with the increasing complexity of crime, the increased difficulty of crime and the impact and pressure on resources meant that our detection rates have started to slip. The work that we're doing underneath that, and I link that to the North East pilot, is the proportionality of investigation. And that's why the North East pilot is so important, because it is about managing demand and managing customer satisfaction. Because the North East pilot will also look at, there's a number of people who want to report crime and they want an immediate answer on what's going to happen. They don't want to repeat their story a number of times. So it really is important about satisfaction as well. So that's why that is important in that. So part of the work that we're doing around detections is understanding what are the levers and what's happening. Why are some of our detection rates falling? Is it across the board? Is it in certain areas? Are there themes that we need to think about in terms of training? Is it workload, and how do we proportionately manage those? And that is the work that we're ongoing to make sure that we start to raise the detection rates and frankly, criminals get the justice they deserve. More importantly, the victims get the service that they need and they deserve. So I hope that at a high level explains some of those complexities and the work we're doing to get on top of that as well.
So in terms of when we like to balance the budget, the reality of our mix of assets within our budget, as we've already said, 85% people, £200 million worth of non-pay and some stuff around the sides, which is relatively immaterial in terms of the budget numbers we're talking about. To catch up the £19.2 million gap in 7 months means we need to start making decisions now. And the reason we need to make the decisions now, and I'm talking about decisions on the slash and burn narrative, if you like, is because of this is linked to reform, it's linked to transformation. If we don't make the decisions when I say now, I'm talking within days and weeks, we need to make decisions about stopping and pausing transformation programs. If we stop the work now, it means we get a 7 to 6 month benefit from not paying for those things, and that contributes to the overall budget gap. If, as we go through this month, next month, we get a bigger contribution to the savings gap, for example, if overtime starts to reduce back into where we said it would be at the £18.9 million point, if staff attrition numbers increase a bit, if we start to see those numbers move, then we might see that we might hit the budget line a little bit earlier than planned. But because we don't have the luxury of waiting now, we need to take the steps to try and land on the budget number at the end of the year. We won't know. I mean, we're going to be watching this. We watch this pretty much every single week at the moment, but we'll take the decisions now to slow things down, to build in a capacity to hit budget. And then if we do see some benefits from some of the bigger ticket items that were in the original plan, then we might be able to ease off. But the thing you have to realize about reform and transformation is once you stop it, it's very difficult to restart it. Because at that point, you may have released people and then you've got to hire them back again. And then you've got another problem because what type of an employer are we if we're stopping and starting an employment? And then there'll be other things we look at, which is contracts and things like that. So again, if you become an employer where people are concerned about, well, will they keep funding you? Then they price you up. So there's a number of consequences, not just on the operational side, which is a huge part of everything we do, but the tactical decisions we're taking underneath this, they have consequences in terms of future years, in terms of making it more expensive for us to do the same thing, in terms of delaying us building capacity to offset a reduction in the workforce. So it's a kind of double whammy of pressures at the moment, which we're trying to manage. So we will hopefully manage the budget to a balanced position at the end of the year. That's about the only commitment I could give you at the moment.
Okay, thank you. I don't have a lot of time left on this item, but Alistair, you wanted to come in, and then Tom. Alistair?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Most of my questions have already been asked, but I have one remaining question. But first of all, I would recognise the report and also recognise the comments that you made in relation to professionalism and the hard work and dedication of officers and staff across Scotland who work in difficult circumstances and will be the major contributors to success or otherwise of Police Scotland going forward. DCC Connors emphasised there the importance to all of this work of the pilot that's taken place in the North East, thinking about delivering for the people of Scotland, customer satisfaction, and helping to manage demand. How are you using this pilot? Are you running a pilot and then evaluating it and feeding and later on? Or are you running the pilot and as lessons emerge, because there's a criticality in delivering in year, are you feeding the lessons in to the work that's being done within policing our communities at this moment in time?
So actually, Alistair, I think the answer to that is both. If there are lessons which come out of the pilot which are applicable, but back to the point around we understand the implications of applying a different tactic, a different technique, a different approach, then we will look to if you like, learn from that organisationally and potentially do things different. However, the entirety of the pilot, we appreciate the nature of the pilot, we appreciate the need to engage with local communities, to understand their concerns, to understand the broader implications. So the pilot per se will be run for 3 months in that division, and it will then be evaluated. And those more, if you like, strategic overarching lessons learned will be part of that evaluation and will determine where the pilot moves, whether the pilot is rolled out nationally or not thereafter. But if there are any immediate, low risk, quick wins that we can take from it, then we will do that.
I've got one more question that I meant to ask. Road safety, the drug driving campaign, and one of the parts of this is that you ran an education and awareness raising programme, which is prevention activities. And now, prevention is normally long term, and I don't want to take away at all from how important it is to live within the budget this year and to maintain the safety and well-being of the people of Scotland. But within all this work, what thoughts are ongoing in terms of prevention, driving down demand in the short, medium and long term?
And of course, that's incredibly important, because actually we need to try to take, as we've already discussed this morning, we need to try to take demand out of the system. We need to do that on multiple fronts. We talked about recorded police warnings and the demand that takes out of the broader criminal justice sort of process, and indeed the capacity that creates for a number of partner agencies as a consequence. We've talked about the benefit of naloxone this morning in terms of saving people's lives and preventing demand going into the NHS and the like. We are also, in terms of that demand reduction piece, doing a lot of work with partners around sort of mental ill health at the moment, again to create capacity in the system. The longer term prevention work taken forward by colleagues predominantly in Malcolm's area of the business. I may hand over to you in a moment, Malcolm, to talk about some of the pieces of work which are ongoing within partnerships, preventions and community wellbeing. Just to give you a flavour of that, Alistair, is very important, just because we can only, I would far rather not detect a crime because it hasn't been committed than detect it after the fact. So I'll hand to Malcolm in a second just to talk about some of the broader pieces of work which are being taken forward in local policing. But we are also committed, and this comes back to Fiona's question as well, we are also committed to preventing deaths on the road. Every single death on the road is a tragedy. We have seen of late some utterly horrific, really tragic incidents, and they have all been predominantly very different to one another, which is why that broader piece of work around getting drug driving into the same place as drink driving now is, that social opprobrium that comes along with drug driving is so important, because actually I don't think that a particular number of roads policing officers per se will prevent some of the individual tragedies that we have seen over the past month. I won't rehearse those individual tragedies. We all know the circumstances that people have lost their lives, and young people have lost their lives on the roads in Scotland over the last month or so. So we absolutely need to get into the space of, I'm sure we'll talk about drug driving sort of shortly. We absolutely need to get into the space of education. We need to be also though in the space of maintaining our roads policing presence in those areas of the country at those times of day, times of year, where actually, in alignment with the campaigns that we're taking forward in roads policing, and again, we touched on those last month, so I won't rehearse those, we think we can have the most effect. And again, Fiona, the effectiveness of the campaigns, the potential impact of reduction in police numbers in a particular part of the organisation is rigorously scrutinised by local commanders and the relevant Deputy Chief Constable. So there is that visibility on the impact that taking certain decisions in terms of the deployment of police officers or members of police staff has. I'll pause there and perhaps, Malcolm, just ask you to pick up on some of the prevention work that colleagues under...
Thank you very much, and I really welcome the observation and the question around about, essentially how do you manage to maintain a focus of attention on prevention when essentially you're having to downsize your organisation and make difficult choices about service delivery amongst everything else that we're doing. I think that the commitment to a public health approach to policing is sufficiently embedded, particularly into local policing, but across the whole of the organisation, that it's part of the fabric of every officer and staff's thinking and everyday actions. We see it through the model that we've developed in C3, we've talked about at some length, in terms of individual assessments around about vulnerability, threat, risk and harm in terms of decision making, rather than criteria based, perhaps round about things that are more arbitrary. For instance, crime types or other assessments have been used in the past. We see it in terms of every response community officer across the organisation, that they know that part of their duty is decision making and discretion, where prevention and better outcomes for communities and individuals is at the heart of what we will support them in terms of that very empowered position that particularly constables on the front line have on a day-to-day basis. And huge credit to the way in which that is used. We talked earlier about recorded police warnings as being one tool which can contribute towards the suite of prevention activity. There is, however, a specific piece of work ongoing around about a more strategic approach to what that community wellbeing offering looks like, and at the heart of that is how we deal with the demand coming from mental health or mental well-being concerns that has an increasing and significant demand on police resource, where not only are we not always the most appropriate service to provide to individuals in the first instance, on many occasions we will be, in terms of crisis situations and threats to life, but we are not necessarily meeting the needs of those individuals, and it's therefore creating a churn which repeats demand into the system. Now that comes into the partnership piece, which Katrina, rightly you flagged. There's really strong interfaces, sometimes difficult to map at national level. There's huge variation and complexity in terms of service availability, but we're committed to doing that and ensuring that from the perspective of better meeting the needs of individuals who, with an increasing number, are presenting themselves or being presented by others to policing, will have their needs better met through a range of interventions that don't necessarily rest with the police. And the next plan for that piece of work to come forward will be into the SPA, and I think we've got an agreement that we're going to do a seminar on that piece of work, which is being scheduled into November as well, and I look forward to more detailed discussion around about what that will look like, what the options will mean, and contextualising all of that within the budget and resource constraints that we've spoken about during the course of the meeting so far. The final thing I want to say is that, at times like this, inevitably the level of scrutiny and accountability into expenditure versus outcomes focus on things that are easily measured. And the challenge with prevention that we've had for many years is it's very difficult to put your finger on a positive outcome and chart it through with either a target or a data set that's going to demonstrate evidence of things that have not happened as a result of your interventions. So I think we need to keep working at that. I'm not suggesting it's hopeless, that we can't do anything. There has been some ground made, but I think it's worth flagging that there needs to be a philosophical commitment to some of that activity from the organisation, with an acceptance, at least in part, that demonstrating performance in the sense of a data set against it is going to be very, very difficult. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the debate. I'm going to attempt to give the summary attitude of the board in this broad, complex area, because it is probably one of the most important junctures that I've been involved in policing. So we approved the budget as a board in March this year, 1.3 billion. That's an extraordinary amount of money. And when we set that budget, the board and your leadership team, DCC Taylor, acknowledged that hard choices would have to be made and service prioritisation would be inevitable. And we've been rehearsing that this morning to some frustration, I think, about how long it's taken. At the same time, the leadership team was absolute in committing to us that a balanced budget would be honoured, which you have repeated today. Even though it goes up to 31st of March, it has to be balanced this financial year, and explicitly assured us that Scotland could be, and indeed would be, policed safely and effectively within that agreed budget. And it's the authorities', this is self-evident, responsibility to hold the service to account for these outcomes, just as we do for forensic services and the SPA corporate. Now, I want to frame this in a sense. Police Scotland's reported forecast overspend of 1.5% in August. In monetary terms, that was around 19 million out of 1.3 billion. And the most recent update highlighted that this, and Grant said this position appeared to be worsening. And the authority has been clear today, and you've made the commitment back to us, that you must take all urgent and effective action to address this and bring the spend into balance without destroying the service or the investment for future years. Now, my view, and I know that's shared by yourself, DCC Taylor, is effective financial management of the budget is a touchstone of effective police management, and financial credibility is the bedrock of service credibility. We cannot let that go. We have to maintain the financial credibility of the police service in Scotland, the commitments that you've made to us, and the support that you've offered the people of Scotland. With planning and mitigations, 1.5% savings within a 1.3 budget must surely be achievable and realistic. That's my non-financial view of this. It's a relatively small amount of money in a very large budget, even though 85% of it is paid, which I do understand. In setting that budget, the board accepted, and you accepted across the table, that there would need to be an explicit prioritisation of services. And that would have an impact on service response in other areas, the point that Katharina was making. We would like, if we could have them, and we would like to earlier, clear metrics for making risk-asset choices related to resource allocation. This is going to be the key, not just for this year, for the next year, 2 years, or 3 years. Without that, even if we had an increased budget, you still have to make risk-related decisions, and we need to know the metrics around a whole range of areas. Of course, we expect Police Scotland to effectively manage this budget and respond to overspend swiftly with mitigations. And it is disappointing, I must say, that the management of the budget and mitigation to address an overspend have been slow off the mark, with some actions only being rolled out now around 6 months into the financial year. I have always had complete confidence in the police service and its senior management. They have operated at the most pragmatic level, dealing with all sorts of challenges, not least COVID and all the programs. I'm completely convinced that this will be delivered as you've absolutely convinced that. Board members, not so much. And I am the chair of a board, and you have to convince them clearly and explicitly you're going to make the prioritizations and you're going to deliver a balanced budget this year. And that will actually not leak into next year or the year after that. That's another challenge. So we know you've got hard decisions. We said you're going to have hard decisions. We said that impacts on a whole range of areas visibly in the public, which the public would see in policing. And we need you to address that really clearly. And in order for us to be even more assured, given the lack of assurance that Grant could give us, we are put in place even greater intensity of oversight. More pressure on you, more pressure on your operational police officers, I'm afraid, more pressure on your finance to come monthly in to talk to us about this. And I hope that isn't an additional burden. I hope that's reflective of the urgency, pace, and the intensity of how you're going to bring this budget back in. And my final question is, I always worried that this becomes a spreadsheet discussion. It's it's not a spreadsheet discussion. This is an operational police discussion. This is, what are we doing in operational policing to keep ourselves safe, and can we do it within this financial envelope, which we agreed that you could do? And I'm not even discussing next year, I'm discussing this year. And next year is another issue, but I want to keep that clear. And the reason I want to keep that clear is I want to be able to advocate for the best budget for policing in the next financial year, which is an open space. But in order to do that, I want us to demonstrate we can control and manage this current budget, which was an increase on flat cash, which we advocated for, in a reasonable way. And I think that summarises, and I give you my approach to this, but the board would actually want to seeking more assurance in more detail. So thank you for your presentation today. Thank you for listening. Now I'm going to give us all a 10-minute break before we come to our guest, the Director General of the National Crime Agency, which is a critical and very welcome appearance before this board. So if you can come back at 5:02, and we'll reconvene then. Thank you. back to the second half this morning of the Police Authority meeting. It's my great pleasure to welcome Graham Bigger to speak for the first time before the board. As you know, Graham is Director General, fairly recently appointed Director General, maybe not in his own terms, but fairly recently appointed Director General of the National Crime Agency, a critical crime partner, justice partner for Police Scotland. I look forward to hearing more about it. Welcome, Graham, and thank you for attending. Very much appreciate that.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Chair. We spoke earlier in the year and felt that it was really important that I came and spoke to the Scottish Police Authority, and not just that, but was held to account by you. So the National Crime Agency, our responsibility is to protect the public from serious and organised crime, and that is the public right across the United Kingdom. We are not an England and Wales body, we are a United Kingdom body. And I'm held to account overall by the Home Secretary in London, but particularly in England and Wales by her, by the Northern Ireland Policing Board in Northern Ireland. And previously I have come up and seen Scottish ministers and other colleagues and partners in Scotland, but never before the Scottish Police Authority. So the Chair and I spoke and thought it was good for me to come along. So I'm really pleased to be here. So as I said, we protect the public from serious and organised crime right across the UK. We do it in three broad ways. We lead the UK's fight against serious and organised crime, so we hold the overall intelligence picture. We pull together all the operational partners, including Police Scotland, of course, to try and ensure that we have what we call 4P, or will be 4D up here, plans, so looking at how you reduce demand, raise defences, protect the public in every way, as well as pursue and disrupt criminals, and do that in a multi-agency way. So we provide that overall leadership and planning. Secondly, the NCA investigates itself the highest harm offenders, so the most serious criminals that are either in the UK or affecting the UK. In our strategy, we have been trying to push that more upstream, overseas, and online, and I can explain a bit more about that recently. But that is with the intent of having more impact on the safety of people right across the UK and including in Scotland. And the third area, the third function that we have is to provide specialist capabilities to law enforcement and police organisations right throughout the UK, including here in Scotland. Now, Police Scotland, of course, is the second largest police force in the UK, and a huge amount of capability and capacity itself, although, as we've been discussing earlier, under strain with budget, but a really capable and impressive organisation. So the support we provide here is of a different nature to the support we would provide to smaller police forces in England. I thought I would say just a couple of words on the threat from serious and organised crime as we see it, and then our response, and then open up for questions if that's helpful, Chair. So on the threat, we produce a national strategic assessment each year on serious and organised crime. One version of which is published, is unclassified, and then we have other versions at different levels of classification with more information in them. They draw on information from a whole range of partners, including from Police Scotland and others in Scotland, and they set out the picture as we see it. So the last version we published for covering all of 2022 showed that serious and organised crime on balance was going up. It was being affected by three broad trends. So the first of it, which was the international geopolitical position, the kind of problems in various parts of the world that was leading to more migration as a kind of global phenomenon, but hitting the UK as well. The Russia's invasion of Ukraine, causing problems in itself, but also changing the routes for drugs trafficking. The takeover by the Taliban in Afghanistan having an effect on heroin production there. But a series of international events that affect how serious and organised crime plays out in the UK. Secondly, we have seen the impact of inflation and the cost of living crisis in the UK, and that has made more people vulnerable to being the victims of crime and also more people susceptible to being drawn into crime in the UK. Not across every threat that we deal with, but across a number. And the third trend, which we saw last year, but has actually been a trend for the last few years, is technology and the advances in technology. And our kind of overarching phrase on that is that more crime is online. We are seeing that, and it was referred to in the updates earlier, in more cybercrime, more online child sexual abuse, more online fraud. So specific crimes that take place online, but also the extent to which technology is just fundamental to every other serious and organized crime, be it the use of cryptocurrency for criminals to launder their money, the dark web for them to advertise their products, secure encrypted devices for them to communicate. So that has been the macro trend that we have seen and that we are all trying to adapt to, but at the moment I feel we are slightly behind the curve on that as a country as well as in my own organisation. The emerging trends we've seen in the last 2 years have been an evolution in cybercrime from a few very sophisticated, largely Russian-speaking groups into them beginning to offer ransomware as a service. It's becoming a market and quite a big economy. And that means that it has lowered the threshold for people to be able to conduct cybercrime. So it's easier to just go and buy a tool to conduct a cybercrime than it used to be. That then is how we need to respond to it, is to try and attack that ecosystem that is there to enable cybercrime. And we've also seen as part of that more of a join-up between cyber and fraud, pure cybercrimes and then the online fraud, which again is supported by a big ecosystem. We've also, an emerging trend that we are worried about is the growth in synthetic opioids. So obviously we have big drug problems right across the UK, and the extent of it and the nature of it varies on the particular issues in Scotland than in other parts of the UK. But we have not seen very widespread use of synthetic opioids in the UK in the same way that we have in the US and Canada, with fentanyl being the example there. 100,000 deaths in the US last year from fentanyl, which dwarf the deaths, obviously in total numbers, but also in proportionate terms that we have here. Tragic that the numbers of death we have here are. So we are really concerned about the risk of synthetic opioids getting more of a hold in the UK, and working hard to avoid that happening. We have seen some use of nitazene south of the border, not actually in Scotland in any numbers, but there's been a spate of deaths from nitazenes, a particular synthetic opioid, over the summer. Not at a level that is out with the normal drug deaths in England, but just a trend that we are watching very carefully. Another one that I mentioned in the paper we sent round is within firearms. So 3D printed firearms emerging as a new threat. Now, this is actually a symptom of our success. We have been very effective right across the UK, including in Scotland, in making firearms hard for criminals to access. Definitely not impossible, and we still see firearms offences in Scotland as we do in England and Wales, but not to the extent that you see in the rest of Europe, definitely not to the extent you see in the US. It is genuinely tough. So criminals are being more adventurous and innovative in how they access firearms. There's been a lot of attempts to import them from outside the UK to convert non-lethal firearms into firearms, and now the new trend, 3D printed firearms. So that was pretty much nothing 2 or 3 years ago. We had one seizure 2 years ago. We had 17 last year, including one in Scotland. So that is happening, and we need to be working really hard, as we are with Police Scotland and across the UK, to stamp on it. So just a word on the response then. So as I mentioned, we produce an overall intelligence assessment. On the back of that, we produce what we call a national control strategy. So working with all partners, including Police Scotland, what should we be doing in each of our agencies to try and reduce the harm as much as we can in drugs, in child sexual exploitation, in firearms, in fraud, in cyber. We produce on the back of that a strategic action plan on each of those individual threats, and that sets out what each organisation should try and do. And it is, and it was mentioned earlier, it is a team sport trying to fight crime in general, and particularly serious and organised crime. So really important that we do that. I chair a national strategic tasking meeting which brings together all the partners, including Police Scotland, to assess how we are doing every 6 months. We met 2 weeks ago and looked at our progress. We set particular targets around fraud and organised immigration crime. I mean, fraud being a big issue up here as it is in England and Wales, organised immigration crime slightly less so than in certainly the south of England. But those are 2 issues that we need to focus more on. Within drugs, we've been trying to switch our efforts from cocaine to heroin a bit more. We have been overly focused on cocaine. Heroin causes more deaths, as you well know, in Scotland. In firearms, I actually removed one of the taskings we've had as a result of the success we have collectively had in improving the response to it. In terms of the NCA itself, we had a very successful year last year, although I will come back to one of Malcolm's caveats on that in a second. But we had 4,700 disruptions from the National Crime Agency alone last year, which is over a dozen a day. Part of our strategy is to try and focus on the more significant disruptions, the things that make more of an impact, upstream, overseas, and online. And we had 364 of those last year, which beat our target, which was to increase by 20%. We actually increased it by 37%. So we were very pleased about that. You'll have seen in the pack that we sent you the kind of numbers of disruptions we've had in Scotland. So our presence in Scotland involves an organised crime partnership based in Gartcosh, which is a joint team with Police Scotland, 15 officers from each force. That's not the entirety of our presence here. We have about between 60 and 70 officers based in Gartcosh, providing a range of functions alongside the OCP. And you'd have seen the disruptions that came from the OCP in Scotland. So 18 of our tilt disruptions, so the most high harm impact disruptions in the last 5 months, 38 support disruptions. And you've seen some examples to the extent we can provide where they're not sub judice in the slides as well. But our impact in Scotland is absolutely not restricted to those disruptions that we have in Scotland. The impact that we have for Scotland is absolutely the disruptions that we are doing nationally and internationally. And internationally, I should say, we provide the route into the rest of the world for policing. We have 145 liaison officers based in 48 countries around the world. We are part of the Five Eyes law enforcement group with, as Fiona mentioned, the FBI and a number of other organizations. We work incredibly closely with Europol. I've just flown back from The Hague to come here from the meeting of the European police chiefs. We work really closely with Interpol. So we have that reach and the ability to work with all those other organizations that thus help us affect crime in Scotland. One example of that is last year, the NCA or our partners internationally seized 250 tons of Class A drugs. Now, not all of that was coming to the UK, but the UK is the largest cocaine market in Europe, so a goodly proportion of it would. So being able to operate further overseas, further upstream, allows us to have a bigger impact than we would if we were just focusing in the UK. Another example of that is what we need to do on cyber and fraud. Of course, we need to try and respond to every fraud that there is, but the impact we're going to have is by being intelligence-led and being proactive. So an example of that, we worked with the FBI, with the Germans and with the Dutch to take down the Genesis marketplace, which was a big ecosystem, I see some nods around the room, where stolen credentials were held, so your kind of online ID, 2 million digital fingerprints of people from around the world, held on a website, and then people could come in and buy them and then use them for fraud. So we worked with lots of international partners to take that down. There were hundreds of people in the UK who were accessing that website, so buying the credentials to use them in fraud. We coordinated 120 arrests, 120 arrests around the UK of people who were doing that. We also work with government to try, both in Scotland but absolutely in England as well, to try and get the right legislation in place. And we do that on the basis of having the best understanding of the problem and then suggesting what the operational solutions might be. So to take one example of that, and I'm very close to concluding, Chair, you'll be delighted to hear. We have assessed the number of people in the UK that we think pose a sexual risk to children. And this is really important to do because, as we well know, it's an underreported crime. And if you just go on the crimes that are reported, you are completely missing the scale of the problem. So we've used a series of statistical methods and our intelligence understanding of the people that are accessing child pornography online to come up with an estimate for the people across the UK who pose a sexual risk to children. And it's a rather startling figure. So across the UK, we assess it is 680 to 830,000 adults who pose some degree of sexual risk to children. So that's 1.3 to 1.6% of the adult population. Now, we are not able to geographically locate these people. These are not people that we know, so we can't give anything more than a pro rata version of what that would be for Scotland. But just if you use a pro rata figure, that would be between 70 and 87,000 adults in Scotland who pose some degree of sexual risk to children. So that puts a startling figure around the problem, provides more urgency to dealing with it, and it also illustrates how the online dimension is so key to child sexual abuse. Child sexual abuse, of course, as all of you in this room know, has been a problem all throughout history. But our assessment, it has definitely been exacerbated by the growth of the internet and the way people are able to access child pornography there and normalize behavior and get together with other groups of people and share material, often where the ability to see new material depends on producing your own. So we think that that has increased the threat. We work very hard with the tech companies with some really good successes, but not nearly enough. And it's that evidence that we're then able to feed into government, which has led to the online safety bill, which passed Parliament in Westminster just I think the week before last. So that is part of the impact we can have as well, is bringing our collective operational experience to try and get the right legislation in place. Two very final points from me. I could go into detail on lots of the examples, but time won't permit us. I did want to call out and praise what Police Scotland have done on the naloxone. They have trailblazed for policing around the UK. They have addressed and surmounted a lot of the obstacles that seem to be in the place, the concerns about what the impact of doing this would be, and that is an example that we are looking to from England and Wales and now trying to roll out throughout police in England. It's used by about 18 forces in England and Wales, but not everyone. And Jane and I were at a Chiefs Council meeting a few months ago, and we were able to talk about the experience here and strengthen the confidence of forces in England to move to that. And that's really important because it saves lives, as you've been able to demonstrate in Scotland and as it needs to throughout the UK. So real gratitude and praise to Police Scotland for doing that. And finally, just to say how much we appreciate working with Police Scotland as an organisation. As I said earlier on, a big police force and a really capable one. Under financial pressure, as you've been absolutely talking about, but still one of our most important partners. We learn a lot from Police Scotland, and we hope that through the work that we do, we're able to play a part in reducing the demand that comes on Police Scotland from the work we are doing to protect the public right across the UK. I'll pause there, Chair.
Thank you very much, Director General. Just before I open it up, just a couple of comments. The National Crime Agency has been in existence roughly the same time, about 10 years as the board. This is the first time a Director General has come to the board. I'm absolutely delighted with our relationship. We're asking the Director General or his representative to come once a year, at least to the board, and to come twice a year to our Policing Performance Committee. The whole purpose of what we are doing together on this is firstly to hold to account the NCA, which is part of our responsibility in a transparent, measured and proportionate reporting. Secondly, to provide to us third-party assurance on the capability of Police Scotland and Police Scotland in turn to provide an assessment to us about the added value of the NCA, both of which have been indicated in the presentation. And the third aspect for us is measuring the impact in Scotland of the NCA keeping us safe. So thank you for your coming today. Thank you for the relationship we are building together. And the board is now open to discuss issues from the Director General's report. I'll come to Tom Halpin first.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thanks for your update. It's greatly appreciated. I'm thinking of the trends that we might expect to see rather than ones we're actually seeing just now. And if you were in other jurisdictions, a word that would come up often would be corruption, but it's never come up in your presentation today. And looking at future threat in United Kingdom and Scotland in particular, given their increasing interconnectivity and dependency on other jurisdictions and economic, etc., it would be natural to expect to see that word starting to feature more. I would just like some reflection on how we might prepare to prevent that and in fact deal with it from lessons that are there in other jurisdictions. Thank you.
No, thank you, very good point, and a fair reflection on the update. It doesn't cover corruption. We do cover corruption both domestically in the UK and internationally. And it isn't just an international phenomenon. So we have an international corruption unit. It's a big priority for the Foreign Office in London, and we work right around the world in tackling corruption. Had amazing successes in Angola, Malawi. We arrested the Chief of Staff to the Mozambique President about a month ago on suspicion of bribery. We've done some work in Pakistan. The whole range of cases. We also host the International Anti-Corruption Coordination Centre in the NCA, where a whole series of countries come together and make sure we are sharing information and pursuing various cases. And so we've supported other cases, including the central bank governor in Lebanon has been a big corruption case. So there is a lot we do internationally, and that matters. But domestically, it really matters too. So the area where we focus most, and there are other areas I can briefly allude to, but is around corruption at the border. So the border is our single best intervention point to try and stop a lot of serious and organised crime, be it bringing in drugs, firearms, people. And it's a border that works by and large very well. But the money that can be made out of those commodities means that there are a lot of efforts to get those commodities through, and part of that is to bribe and corrupt people at the border. And we see that in port security companies, we see it in people working at airports, and we see it occasionally in border force officers themselves who are doing the law enforcement duties at the border, much less often. And so we work really closely with all of those organisations to try and identify that corruption and tackle it, and we've had a number of successes. That, of course, is not the only type of corruption. Another type of corruption that you see in the UK is around in local government and around planning authorities in particular. Again, money that can be made out of that. We in the NCA spend less effort on that ourselves. As a separate organisation set up called NATIS that works with local authorities and investigates bribery and corruption in local authorities. We provide support to them when they need extra support, and that comes up occasionally.
Any other questions? If I can just ask you this before other people, it's about the fraud and making it related to Scotland. Our data on fraud is increasing in all sorts of aspects in terms of the prevalence of it, but Police Scotland's detection rates are low and probably one of the lowest forms. And I think that's true across a whole range of police service, certainly within the UK more widely. So the board's concern would be, what added value are you bringing to Police Scotland's capability here? Because this is an issue which is going up the political agenda and the policy agenda. People feel very vulnerable, especially for cyber-enabled fraud. So what can you tell us about your engagement, your working with Police Scotland with this and your shared agenda to actually address this issue, as you mentioned, both internationally and within the United Kingdom?
So I don't have the figures on Scotland to hand, but on England and Wales, the crime survey in England and Wales, fraud now accounts for 41% of crime that people report to that survey, which is an extraordinary figure, and it wasn't captured in crime statistics until 2016, and as a result did not get the attention it deserved. That went up quite a lot in COVID. It actually has come down since COVID. So we've had 2 or 3 quarters now of the total figure being down. It's still really high, so that's not to underplay it at all. The other figures that we capture are through action fraud. So the crime survey in England and Wales is people responding to a survey and saying, yes, I have been the victim of a fraud or someone tried to defraud me. The reports into action fraud are people who have been defrauded and then want to report it to the police, so it tends to be the more serious frauds. The numbers there have stabilized slightly. They were going up for a number of years and have come down a little bit over the last year, as has the total value of the frauds. So it may be that we have reached a bit of a plateau and that our efforts to try and tackle this are beginning to have some effect. So that's the kind of the broad picture in terms of the number and the value of frauds. Your question was, what value do we then add to it? So a range of things. So like the other, all the other serious and organised crime threats that we talked about, we pulled together an overall strategic action plan. We host the National Economic Crime Centre in the NCA that brings together a range of operational partners and private sector partners to try and work together to tackle fraud and other economic crimes. That has included, for example, the telecoms industry. So you will have all seen or felt, 2 years ago, a massive increase in the number of text messages, fraudulent text messages that were coming into you and saying, to pick up a parcel, you need to click here, which were frauds. You will hopefully also have noticed that in the last year, you haven't been getting those so much. So that was work that we did with Ofcom and with the telcos to collectively discuss this massive increase, to understand what was happening, which was basically bulk text messages being sent out from overseas numbers, but that were spoofed to appear as if they were coming from domestic numbers. And with Ofcom and the telcos, we managed to find a way of adjusting the way the telcos let text messages go out and block them. So that's one example of what we are doing with fraud. Another I mentioned earlier on is tackling the ecosystem that's behind it, the Genesis Market takedown. So fraud is largely driven by people being able to steal data and use that data to then conduct their frauds and take money from people. There's thousands of stolen credentials on the internet, on this Genesis marketplace, identified these individual marketplaces and then take them down and prosecute the people that are behind them. So trying to be more proactive and intelligence-led in doing it. The other part of it is detection rates, so they are low. I mean, detection rates are low for crime generally in the UK. There is a broader issue there, which is becoming more and more expensive, more resource intensive to investigate more and more complex crimes. And there is a correlation between that and then detection rates. Detection rates on fraud have been low. We have been working hard at that with the City of London Police, who lead on fraud in England and Wales. And that was another thing that we discussed at the National Tasking meeting that I mentioned 2 weeks ago. So we have the detection rates for each force, and we've been working really hard with them, as the city has, to upskill all the forces and to make sure that they are really focused on it and dealing with it in their performance meetings. And the percentage of judicial outcomes that we are getting from those individual cases is, as a result, inching up.
Thank you very much. Now, before I bring Katarina Casper in, I should have brought DCC Jane Connors in to make a comment from Police Scotland's perspective about your relationship and work. Forgive me. I wonder if you'd like to make any comment now about the presentation and your general work with the NCA.
I'm happy to take questions, Chair, and then I can round up afterwards if that's more convenient, or I can make a statement now. Yeah, it's fine.
Take some questions now and come back, if that's okay. Katarina.
Yes, thank you very much. I found actually it does link to the previous subject of fraud that we've just been discussing. And I probably should say, as an MLRO, I do have a bit of an interest in fraud as well as anti-money laundering collaboration between the law enforcement as well as the private sector. And you did touch on this a little bit, but I'm just really quite personally interested, but I also think it's in the public interest to understand whether there is any barriers between even closer collaboration between, let's say, from the financial services industry and law enforcement, because quite often with fraud, the way the regulation and legislation is heading, the cost of fraud isn't just borne by the individuals, it is also borne by the industry as well. So it's, it kind of hits across everybody. So, and I know that from an industry perspective, there is a lot of data that is being submitted into law enforcement through suspicious activity reports, etc. But sometimes, from an industry perspective, again, and from a public perspective, it's what do we get back and is there any intelligence? So I'm really interested in what are the barriers and how could collaboration be improved from your perspective? Thank you.
So with the financial sector, it's been really strong and is decades old, as you were kind of alluding to, anti-money laundering. Fraud has been kind of newer as the rise in fraud has kind of caught everyone's attention. Initially was kind of card not present fraud, as you'll be aware of, so the bank details being stolen and money just being taken. The banks reacted really quite well to that and made that technically much harder. And so the fraudsters moved on to more social engineering technique, so persuading you to hand over your money to someone else, authorized push payment, as they call it. So I mentioned earlier on that we work quite closely with the telecommunication companies, and that's how we reduced the text messages. The cooperation is much deeper with UK finance and the financial sector generally. They put a range of measures in place which they discuss with us. So they are part of the National Economic Crime Centre. We have kind of frequent discussions with them as we look at the intelligence picture that they are seeing and the intelligence picture that we are seeing. You are right that there's been quite a significant burden on the financial sector on anti-money laundering and suspicious activity reports. We are trying to reduce that. Legislation that's just gone through UK Parliament and the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Bill allows those reports to be more tailored. And we are building up our capacity in our financial intelligence unit to analyse all of those reports more carefully and get more actionable intelligence out of them. One other thing that we work with the government on, which will help with this, is to put in a failure to prevent fraud provision into the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency. There's been a failure to prevent bribery and corruption, alluding to Tom's question earlier on, and tax evasion for a number of years now. And that's been quite successful, not because there have been lots of convictions of companies for failure to prevent bribery or tax evasion. That wasn't really the intent. The intent was to change companies' behavior and improve their internal controls to make it less likely. And we are hoping that the same will happen with the failure to prevent fraud measure, that companies will tighten their controls. And as Fiona mentioned earlier on, it's much better for crimes not to take place in the first place. The final area in terms of cooperation with the private sector is the tech sector. So if the banks were the main vector for fraud within the private sector previously, it is very much the tech sector now. We worked, for example, with Google. So investment fraud is the one where people lose the most money. They are persuaded to invest in what they think is a good investment and turns out to be a straight fraud. A lot of that is conducted online with fake websites being put up that look incredibly genuine. And that was happening right throughout the internet and obviously therefore in the UK, and companies would pretend to be regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. The websites would say that. And the way that Google would do their searches and their, the searches that come up at the top of your search when it's an advert did not have a check that automatically checked whether the firm that was being advertised actually was regulated by the FCA. So we worked for 2 years with Google and ultimately persuaded them to put an automated check in place. Now, the criminals will adapt, they always do, they will find a new way of doing it, but that then had an impact on the prevalence of investment fraud ads online, and as a result should reduce the incidence of people being the victims of investment fraud.
Thank you. Fiona McQueen?
A similar theme, and I'm not sure if it's DCC Connors or the Director General. I'm interested in the organisational learning that would go from NCA into Police Scotland and how that is taken forwards, particularly is there a systematic approach to it?
Well, I would just say, it's absolutely two-way. Police Scotland is a much bigger organisation than us, dealing with a huge range of challenges, and also has a really close relationship with the government in Scotland. So, Police Scotland with the government had a fraud strategy that we looked at down in England and Wales to learn kind of lessons from. It goes the other way too. We can share lessons from the UK, and that is actually also one of the specialist capabilities that we provide. I didn't go through and list them all in detail, but major crime investigative support, a team we have that when there is a major homicide that is complex or a major investigation that is complex, any police force around the UK, including Police Scotland, can draw on and come to us, and we just have the database of national experts, including some that we directly employ, that we can point to support any investigation. And Police Scotland would typically come to us with a case about 10 times a month, and we would find some way of helping. But it's absolutely two-way, because this is a powerful and capable organisation that we learn a lot from too.
Final question from you, Caroline, and then we'll come back to DCC Connors.
Thank you, and thank you for your report. It's very interesting. I'm going to come back to your point about the numbers being around about 41% of crime and the sort of global nature of it, and also the fact that it's very well funded with more money than we'll probably ever have to throw at these things. And so, having worked in a global technology company for a large part of my career, one of the things we used to talk about was the power of the crowd. And so I'm wondering if that's featuring in your strategy. And what I mean by that is almost sort of using the similar have in the army as a special reserve, or in police forces, you know, special constables, but these people are specifically working in industry and actually helping you to detect and stop these crimes. Because one of the things, these people will move, we've taken down that Genesis, which is fantastic, but there'll be another 5 have opened up somewhere else. You know, that's just the nature of it. And so how do you ever keep on top of it? How do you keep ahead of it? Because they are really 10 steps ahead of us at any stage. So I'm just wondering if that's featured in, because that's, I think, one of the ways that we will actually get on top of this is actually having a big specials kind of reserve, which is people actually who are in industry and actually acting on our behalf. Thanks.
So I think we do it in kind of 3 ways. We do have NCA specials, completely different from special constables in policing. Normally these are just experts that we that volunteer to help us and kind of bring their experience and deep knowledge to support us. So there is that. There are then a range of cybersecurity companies and so on whose whole business is to disrupt cybercriminality, investigate fraud, and we work with them. I was with one yesterday in The Hague. And then it is how we can get the best possible support from those major tech companies. And that can be challenging. So there have been some really strong and powerful cooperations with tech companies on crime generally, and child sexual abuse. Meta provides an enormous number of tip-offs into an organization in the US called NECMEC, which then come to us, and we feed out to the relevant police forces. And that has been really strong. If you want to probe me on it, I can say how that's massively under threat at the moment and a real risk. They have helped, frankly, less on fraud over the years. I think it has been more of a new phenomenon of the tech companies being used as a vector for fraud, but they have not reacted as quickly to that. We chair with Tech UK an online fraud steering group. We have all the tech companies together to try and find the best ways of reducing it. But I think of all the industries that we work with, that's the one where they need to improve their game the most.
Thank you very much. I'm going to come to you now, DCC Jane Connors, to make your contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the Director General for coming up here today, and I think highlighting the close working relationship between the NCA and Police Scotland, which is really, really important. It's important for us because we are co-located at Gartcosh. We know that the crime hub, it enables really fast time being able to talk to people, understanding the capabilities that the NCA have, which other forces don't have that ability to understand exactly what the NCA can help us with. Sharing our capabilities with them, it's very much a joint process, and has already been covered, it's that learning point as well. Making sure that we are part and parcel of the wider crime, and particularly the serious and organised crime. It doesn't respect boundaries. We've said that a number of times. And being able to have the specialist capabilities of the NCA means that we have that outward look, which is so very important. I just wanted to touch on a couple of things, particular areas that have been spoken about. I think the first one is probably fraud, which we know and has been addressed at this a number of times, and cyber interlinked with that as well. What's really important for us is around the capability of that. We've already talked about the City of London Police. They did a peer review on Police Scotland about our capability, because we're not part of some of the national structures, although we're very closely involved. And we had a series of recommendations, but a very positive outcome from that. So we have a really good platform to build on in terms of fraud. And coming back to what the Director General was saying, developing those capabilities, understanding what fraud is about, where it's happening, what are the themes, and being able to get ahead of it, which is that prevention. We don't want to be reacting to harm, we want to be able to prevent it, and that's key to that. And I just wanted to mention Abertay University, and this was at Professional Reference Group with Caroline. They have a cohort of people there, a cyber and fraud hub, where we can feed in real world problems into them. And they have all the enthusiasm and the motivation of cohorts of people there who then help us solve those real world problems. And again, that's the type of thing that links back to the NCA to improve our capability and understanding of these different issues. So I think in terms of fraud, there's a particular focus, and the NCA are really important at that because of the international borders. I'd also like to touch on the abuse of children, which is something that we're all absolutely, abhorred by. It's absolutely horrendous. It's something, again, that is a particular focus, and the Director General highlighted just the severity and the volume that is going on in terms of people in the communities. Some of the things that we're doing, particularly linking in with the NCA, is when packages or information comes into Police Scotland about individuals or things that are happening, the intelligence from the NCA is now much more streamlined, which means the process to actually get out and find that individual is much quicker. So that is something that's a particular example where working with the NCA is improving our response. And then being able to work on the threat and risk assessment, people who are actually actively trying to meet children in that moment, identifying that through the risk assessment, which puts them at very high, means we can take an immediate action. And others, we always take action, but safeguarding comes at the top. Again, real-world examples of where working with the NCA and intelligence is speeding up our processes as well. So a lot of work that we're doing in the online child space as well. We have new software that does that as well, and we're feeding in very much through the CADE system, FM, which went through the critical pathway around making sure that first-generation images, which are new images, these are new victims, are identified early, and we're safeguarding those victims, as well as managing second, third generation. So a huge amount of work going on in that space, good capability from Police Scotland, massively supported by the NCA and the whole work, but coming back to the relationships, the positive working, and the joint co-location at Gartcosh, which is something that really a lot of other forces don't have, but we do, and it is paying dividends, tackling, again, the highest harm on the criminals. So that's everything from me, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for that assurance both from the Director General about the capability and capacity of Police Scotland, and as it's reciprocated at the working together. Part of the role of the board is to promote and support policing, and we often do that by seeking third-party assurance. I think your comments about the naloxone reflected my own at the beginning. You underestimate the importance sometimes of change and its complexity, and I took a lot from your observation that Police Scotland is leading in the UK. I don't often have sight of what's happening in the rest of the United Kingdom, but from that assurance about the role. So I'm very pleased that you're able to come here and give us your annual report, and as the years go on, we hope to hear more from you and your officers here. Are there any final comments you'd like to make? And you're very welcome to stay, but I know you're very busy.
No, just thank you very much for the opportunity to come. I mean, we do think it is really important that what we do in Scotland and for Scotland, and coming here to discuss it and be held to account for that matters to us.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your time. I'm going to move swiftly on to item 7, which is our Chief Executive's report. Chief Executive.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to draw the board's attention to a number of things. I'm starting with the pre-budget scrutiny by the Criminal Justice Committee. I attended that session with colleagues from Police Scotland, and it's already been mentioned earlier on this morning. I just want to say that I made the point that we acknowledged that the budget allocation was better than expected, and that was a positive development. However, the setting of a balanced budget was challenging and hard choices had to be made, and that has played out this morning as well. I reiterated the board's priorities to maintain a balanced budget going forward, and also the tension between the development of sustainable policing and forensic services. And I explained the board's 3 areas of focus in the current year and beyond: capacity, which is based on demand; capability, covering technology and transformation; and culture, which is the oversight of policing together. The authority continues to work with Police Scotland and the government to ensure the implications of the potential financial settlement on policing are fully understood. I'd like to draw the authority's attention to the fact that the new website went live Monday the 4th of September. That was the result of years of work, and the intention is to promote our transparency. Therefore, with transparency, you have more accountability. I'd like to report that we have gone to the digital service within Scottish Government, and they do an assessment of our digital standards. 13 out of the 14 areas we passed. There's just one still to be delivered, and we're working with Police Scotland colleagues and ICT to do that over the next few weeks, and we'll report in due course to ARAC on that. I'd like to draw the board's attention to, it's actually the Climate Change Week next week from the Scottish Government, and the reason this is here is that we had a very good presentation by police colleagues from Police Scotland on the work that they do. It's really impressive, and I'd like to just say that I'm intending next year for that to be brought to the board about this time of the year so you can understand that, because they're making real progress. I'd like to congratulate the SPA Finance team who've been nominated for the SITFA Public Finance Award in 2023, Finance Team of the Year. This was won last year by Police Scotland Finance Team for their work on COP26. And last year as well, you know, the SPA won an award around governance and risk. And this is really to show that earlier on we've been looking at finance. The finance control within the authority and Police Scotland is strong. We've got real challenges, but the fact that we are being recognised nationally for that work is to be commended. The Scottish Railways Policing Committee met on the 14th of September. Again, the authority was represented by Mr Halpin and Mary Caithley, and a full report is attached. Chair, if I may, I'd like to give a verbal update. We touched on it earlier on the annual report and accounts, and I just want to give an update to the board. As you know, the annual report and accounts, we do not discuss that until the reports have been led in Parliament. And the report is the auditor's report, and the accounts are on private session later on this morning or this afternoon. What I'd like to say, though, is when we took those reports to ARAC, about a week later, it was intimated that there were two key assurances that were missing from the result of other audits out with our audit. And that is assurances from two pension funds, the Tayside and Highland, who have got members of police staff in those funds. And the reason the assurances are not there is that there's a delay in their audit, and their audit is carried out by Audit Scotland. So I wrote to the Auditor General asking him to confirm when we would get our assurance certificates. The reply I have is that due to COVID and recovery from COVID, it should be mid-October. The reason I'm bringing it to your attention, Chair, and to the board is that the finance staff within Police Scotland and the SPA and forensics took a decision back in 2020, which was an expectation of the board that we would always meet our deadline, which is the 30th of September. We have done that in September 20, September 21, September 22, and September 23. And I have been informed by our previous auditor that that is not consistent across public organisations. So there's been real efforts, and we have done that this year. So I'm very disappointed that I'm expecting this afternoon to have a good audit report, but the auditor cannot give a final opinion till she receives these assurances from Audit Scotland, which means we will be delaying laying the accounts in Parliament. I shall go back to the Auditor General saying that we are disappointed that that is the case, and I'm looking forward to receiving those assurances mid-October. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Chief Executive. Any questions to the Chief Executive on her report? Thank you very much, and we'll discuss the accounts in private. Thank you for that public note to us. Going to come now to our final item in public, agenda item 7, the Forensic Services Director's Report, and introduce the Director of Forensic Services, Fiona Douglas. Fiona.
Thank you, Chair. So I'll take my report as read and just highlight several areas within my report for members. I want to start with the financial position for the organisation, in that Forensic Services remains on target to deliver a balanced budget in line with the funding awarded for this financial year. Underpinning that budget is a detailed efficiencies plan across a range of areas within Forensic Services, primarily around non-staff related costs. We've also reviewed the rollout of our new operating model within forensic services to ensure that we only take forward stages of that new operating model as and when we've got sustainable resources to do so. Within that budget, however, there has been an overspend within this financial year in relation to outsourcing of post-mortem toxicology casework, and that's to support the transition of the service from Glasgow University to forensic services. However, that has been mitigated by underspends around the staff vacancies, which mean that we are currently able to forecast a break-even budget for this year. Moving into more detail around the new operating model, I've talked to the board previously around the detail of what we're trying to achieve, but really it's around having a more resilient and responsive forensic service to support our partners in Police Scotland and the Crown Office Procurator Fiscal Service and PERC. In the last few months, we have undertaken a considerable amount of work in relation to progressing the transformation of the service. In my previous update to members, I talked about the new tasking abilities that we have in the organisation and being able to task our scene examination resource nationally and professionally across Scotland in a more effective way. The key milestone that we have achieved through this period really relates to the transition to the newly designed leadership and management structure within forensic services. So within the new operating model, there is a complete restructure of management and leadership roles across the organisation. So we've made substantial progress in implementing a number of those new roles, and that in itself will lead to improvement around performance management, delivery of best value and efficiency across the service, and most importantly, ensuring the safety and well-being of our staff. In the Forensic Services Committee meeting in August, I presented the year-end report for 22-23 financial year, and it's a significant moment for forensic services where during that financial year we actually output more work than the demand for our service. And that is the first time and the first year that we've been able to do that since the inception of forensic services as a national organisation in 2007. So it is a substantial point in time to reflect that all of the work that we have done through the strategic planning around Forensics 2026, which was our earlier strategy, has really drawn the benefits that we are now seeing within the organisation. The Memorandum of Understanding has been an ongoing piece of work with Forensic Services Police Scotland and the Crown Office Procurator Fiscal Service colleagues for a number of years. And we have successfully reviewed and refreshed the Memorandum of Understanding. The final version was presented to the last meeting of the Forensic Services Committee. And we've just in the final stages of getting a signature from the Crown Office on that document, but we will be moving into implementation of the new MOU in the coming days and weeks. That will ensure the effective delivery of forensic services. It's really important to build upon the improvements that we've made across the service around capacity and demand, and really making sure that we're making good judgments across all three organisations to make best use of forensic services provision and to derive the best value that we can out of the work that the service undertakes. My report also highlights the work of our professional and dedicated scientists and staff across the service. And an example of that relates to the conviction of Connor Gibson, who was convicted on the 26th of July in the High Court in Glasgow of the murder of Amber Gibson. There was also a further conviction of Stephen Corrigan in relation to that case. These convictions followed extensive evidence led by forensic services scientists, which included marks found on clothing and analysis of many DNA samples. I'd like to conclude my remarks by reflecting on the Forensic Services Excellence Awards, which are being held tomorrow, and that will highlight the exceptional work, or at least some of the exceptional work that is carried out across forensic services. In particular, looking at the contribution to forensic science, improvements made across the service, science and innovation, and a large amount of projects and detailed work around making sure that we are developing our science to support what Police Scotland and the Crown Office require from forensic services, and also focused on work that has been undertaken in the organisation to improve the well-being of our staff. So I'll pause there, Chair, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Chair. I've got two very quick questions. Firstly, memo of understanding. It's terrific we've got this far, but can you give me an indication of when you expect the Crown Office to be signing it off?
Certainly. So I would expect that to be imminent in the days to come. So the Crown Office have had the document for a short while. So we've had an indication that there aren't any issues. It's really just going through the formalities of the process.
So it's days rather than weeks?
Absolutely.
Super, that's good to hear. The second thing is regarding post-mortem toxicology and the transfer from Glasgow University Project Weaver. And at the last committee, we were hearing about the large backlog of cases. Can you give us an update on that as to where we are in terms of narrowing the gap in the turnaround times?
Of course. So as part of the transfer of the post-mortem toxicology provision from Glasgow University, there has been a lot of detailed work undertaken, supported by colleagues in Police Scotland Digital Division in particular, but also estates and others. As a result of the transfer, there has been a number of processes that have had to be validated and brought online. All of those processes are online. We had a detailed discussion at the Forensic Services Committee with regards to finalising the implementation, which is really getting to the steady state of achieving service levels that are agreed with the Crown Office. We are still on track to deliver the service levels by the end of October, which is a standard 5-week turnaround time. We have reduced the caseload since the Forensic Services Committee meeting by 24%, so it's very much, the trajectory is very much on track to make sure that that target is delivered. For several months now, we've been delivering the priority cases within the timescale agreed with the Crown Office, so it's very much an improving position and is on track.
Thank you very much. Alistair?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Fiona, for your report, and I hope in Forensics Excellent Awards it goes well tomorrow night. Recognising staff that do a vital role is extremely important. My question is in relation to performance in 22-23, where it says it exceeds demand significantly, 1.5. I'm just curious, it said this year was the first in which output exceeded demand. I would have thought output should match demand to be as efficient as possible. Could you maybe just expand upon that? What does that actually mean?
Of course, thank you for the question. And I think for a number of years now, the critical issue that we've been discussing in Forensic Services Committee and other forums prior to that has been the inability to be able to really manage the demand into forensic services in alignment with the capacity which is available. And I think we've discussed over a number of years how we can get that into balance, because I completely agree those two should be balanced. As a result of a number of years where that has been the case, where demand has significantly exceeded capacity across a range of areas within the service, we have got quite substantial caseloads, backlogs if you wish, in a number of areas, and in particular the impact is on the speed at which forensic services can provide results, particularly investigative support to local policing in particular, because the prioritisation within the service is around the most serious crime, as you would expect, also meeting court dates, and then as you work down that list, we have a number of, or a large proportion of cases within the service that are exceeding the timeliness requirements that our partners within Police Scotland and the Crown Office would expect. So really the consequence of getting that the right way around, we are starting to eat into those caseloads and starting to improve the timeliness performance across the organisation. That will be complemented by the change programme and the delivery of the new operating model as we start to get the timeliness to a place where we're better able to support the police investigation timescales in particular. And we're seeing really positive progress towards that. So it's really that is a key milestone of the decisions and the investment that has happened to date to get us to that position. There is much more work to be done around strategic workforce planning to make sure that we create the service in line with the demands that Police Scotland and the Crown Office will have of us in the years to come. And we have a piece of work that we will be starting to get a better demand forecast in the long term to make sure that the workforce structure and capability matches the expectations of our partners in Police Scotland in particular.
Grant McRae.
Thanks, Chair. And Fiona, thank you very much for confirming in the course of what you've just said that forensics is operating within the budget envelope that's been approved. That's excellent news. I'm delighted to hear this. I wonder if you could say, are you starting to plan for the years ahead? Because I know that several things that you wish to do have got quite a long lead time.
Thank you very much for the question. And there is a longer-term efficiencies planning process in place within forensic services to look at not just the efficiencies which are planned for this financial year, but also in years to come. So there is very much a focus on making the organisation as efficient and effective as possible. The demand forecast piece of work is particularly important to make sure that we're shaping the service in accordance with what our partners require of forensic science to support policing and support justice outcomes. We need to do a more thorough review of demand and capacity in the workforce planning piece. And I think that will allow us to have a better picture around what is actually required from forensic services, but also in the current economic climate and the funding that is available, it will allow us to much better articulate what we can and cannot achieve within the particular funding envelope. We are going through a period of transformative change within the organisation, which is the culmination of several years of work. And it's really pleasing to start to see the benefits. And we've, again, a piece of work to do benefits tracking in detail so we can start to identify not only the benefits that are being realised, but also how we can identify further efficiencies that we can bring into the service moving forward. So we're putting all of the building blocks in place, particularly through the new management structure, through training our managers effectively, that allow us to identify those efficiencies and to be more lean in the future to respond to that changing economic picture.
Thank you very much. That's very
Thank you very much. Any other questions?
Thanks, Fiona. And it's a lot of effort to get output greater than demand. That's a milestone for forensic services, so I just want to acknowledge that. A big element, notwithstanding there's still the pressures in specific areas, and no doubt the committee will continue to work with you on that. But a big bit of the business case in relation to the investment, because there was significant investment made in forensic services, was to get more effective about volume crime. And given the pressures on Police Scotland just now in terms of detection rates, etc., it's extremely important we don't lose sight of that. Are you able to give us some sort of insight into how progress has been made in that area?
Thank you, Tom. And I would reflect that the business case for the new operating model for forensic services is primarily around delivering better forensic science support in acquisitive or volume crime cases. And that is particularly around speeding up the provision of forensic intelligence. Within forensic services, we are self-funding the large element of the implementation of the new operating model. So that has a consequence of extending the time frame for when we would expect to realise the benefits. So the new operating model was not about growing capacity, it was all about doing work faster. So now that we have gone over the hump of the issue around capacity and demand being out of balance, providing it stays that way moving forward, which I think the MOU will help with, then what we need to do is to progress the change at a pace that we can afford, but then allows that sequential improvement in the delivery of the speed in which we can provide forensic intelligence for acquisitive crime, and absolutely understand the challenges of my Police Scotland colleagues and anything that forensic services can do to support that and help with that challenge. The operating model and our direction of travel is absolutely aligned with that.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Thank you very much, Fiona, for your report, and thank you very, very much for your leadership and the work of all your staff within forensic services. That then concludes the public session of the board. I'd like the board to reconvene at 1:45 for the private session. So thank you very much.